The Select Committee will come to order. At this, the beginning of Ramadan, as Muslims around the world commemorate Prophet Muhammad receiving the first revelations of the Quran, we are here to face a horrifying truth. The Uyghurs, many of whom practice the Muslim faith, are being erased. Genocide is occurring, this time at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. We are privileged to have with us many members of the Uyghur community. We are deeply grateful for your bravery, and we know that it has come at a great cost. As we prepare to hear firsthand testimony from the CCP's concentration camps, I would like to turn to Alicia Wiesel, whose father, Auschwitz survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, singularly captured the horrors of the Holocaust in his book, Night. Without objection, the video will be added to the record, and the clerk will play the video.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and the whole Select Committee. Last year, I spoke to the United Nations on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. My speech highlighted the Uyghur cause. Some people were confused. Others sought to dissuade me. What, they asked, does the Holocaust have to do with the Uyghurs? The answer is, we may say never again, but genocide is, in fact, happening again, and it is happening on our watch. You are sitting in Washington, D.C. I am sitting in New York. Some are watching from Beijing. These places sometimes feel like the center of the universe, but they are not. There is a place right now where an entire people spend their days either experiencing or living in fear of imprisonment, forced sterilization, and torture. There is a place where the absence of a free press creates a blanket of darkness under which these crimes occur. There is a place from which a handful of eyewitnesses, such as Gulbahar Haitiwaji, have survived to tell their story, as my father did with Night. My father swore in his Nobel Prize speech never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. Xinjiang is the center of the universe. Dear members of the Select Committee, thank you for bringing us there with you.
Tonight, we have two guests whose stories will take us to the center of the universe, to the place where the world's moral attention should be focused, to Xinjiang. These two women were both inside the concentration camps. They are first-hand witnesses to the systemic, unimaginable brutality. Witnesses to the attempted elimination of a people, a culture, a civilization. Witnesses to the largest extrajudicial mass internment of a religious minority since the Holocaust. Witnesses to erasure. That's why Elie Wiesel, who swore to fight those who would forget, he swore to fight those who would avert their gaze. Today, in fact, we had a high-profile hearing on the Hill where the CEO of a major company called TikTok was asked no less than 4 times whether what's happening in Xinjiang is a genocide, and he refused to answer. The least we can do on this committee is to make sure that in 50 years, when the Xinjiang genocide is remembered as one of the abominations of the 21st century, no corporate executive, no policymaker, no investor, no university president can look their grandchildren in the eye and claim they didn't know. I now recognize the ranking member, Raja Krishnamurthy, for his opening statement.
Good evening, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tonight we will hear the harrowing testimony of Uyghur and Muslim women who were jailed in mass internment camps by the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. The pain and suffering these women endured is horrifying. The evidence presented here has not only been corroborated by the testimony of other survivors, but also by thousands of pages of leaked internal CCP documents, photographs, and even satellite imagery. The CCP's genocide against Uyghurs and other Muslim groups is real. Not only is it going on to this day, it is expanding. It is not too late to confront these atrocities so that the famous saying, "never again," can actually become a reality. The CCP's genocide did not happen overnight. It was the result of decades of planning. This crackdown has been both methodical and monstrous. A CCP religious affairs official described what they're doing to the Uyghurs in this way, quote, break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. Completely shovel up the roots of, quote, two-faced people, dig them out, and vow to fight these two-faced people until the end. Today, we know that as many as 2 million Uyghurs and other Muslims have been jailed in mass concentration camps. They are subjected to political indoctrination, torture, forced labor, and other human rights abuses. Countless people have been disappeared. Nearly 500,000 Uyghur children have been taken from their families, and tens of thousands of women have been forcibly sterilized. Even outside the camps, Chinese high-tech companies work closely with government officials to impose a pervasive and high-tech surveillance system that has been called an open-air prison. The tech ecosystem used to repress Uyghurs has global implications. The PRC's largest high-tech companies are exporting surveillance, facial recognition, and social tracking technologies to other countries from Iran to Syria to Burma, and thereby undermining democratic movements worldwide. In addition, the CCP has long viewed Xinjiang as a strategic gateway critical to the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative. International companies were invited into Xinjiang and have based their supply chains on cheap sources of labor, which have turned out to be forced labor. As a result, the global economy has been contaminated by products made by forced labor, including about 20% of the world's cotton and half of the world's polysilicon used in solar panels. In 2021, Congress passed the bipartisan Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that forces companies to move their supply chains to ensure they are not profiting from forced labor and genocide. More needs to be done, and this committee can help lead the way. Make no mistake, CCP leaders are absolutely listening to us closely this evening. They are intensely focused on world opinion, and they fear being held accountable by the international community for their actions. This evening, let's make sure the CCP hears us loud and clear. Their genocide must end. Tonight is the second night of Ramadan. Thousands of my constituents, millions of our fellow Americans, and countless others are celebrating the holiday with families. In our country, they are free to practice their religion, and although I am not Muslim, I wish them Ramadan Mubarak. In the PRC, however, Xi Jinping has decided to continue the Sinicization of Islam. Sinicization of Islam means that men are not allowed to wear beards and women cannot wear hijabs. In short, unlike here, freedom of religion in China means the freedom to practice religion as Chairman Xi sees fit. That is not freedom, that is tyranny. I close with the case of Dr. Gulshan Abbas, a Uyghur medical doctor who was forcibly disappeared in 2018. Gulshan was sentenced in 2020 to a 20-year prison term because her American sister, Rushan Abbas, criticized the CCP from here within America. I know this situation well because Rushan was my State of the Union guest. Gulshan has serious health conditions and has never been involved in political activism whatsoever. As with others, I say to the CCP, release Gulshan and the others now. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. If any other member wishes to submit a statement for the record, without objection, those statements will be added to the record. We are deeply privileged this evening to hear from two first-hand witnesses to the Uyghur Genocide. We are honored to have with us tonight Ms. Gulbahar Haitiwaji, an incredibly brave woman who spent 2 years in a Xinjiang camp. She's the author of How I Survived a Chinese Re-Education Camp, a Uyghur Women's Story, the first published account describing life inside the camps. Ms. Haitiwaji lives in France with her family, and we are incredibly grateful that she traveled here to share her story with us. We are also privileged to be joined by Ms. Qelbinur Sidik, a human rights activist and witness to the genocide in Xinjiang, Ms. Sidik worked as a Chinese language teacher for primary school students before she was assigned to work as a teacher in the Reeducation camp. After seeing and experiencing atrocities firsthand, Ms. Sidik has become an extraordinary advocate for all those languishing under the thumb of the CCP. She resides in the Netherlands, and we are grateful that she traveled to be with us here tonight. Welcome, and thank you for being with us here this evening. If you could please stand and raise your right hand, I will now swear you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? You may be seated. Let the record show that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. Thank you. Ms. Haitiwaji, you may begin.
Salam hanımlar, efendiler, ben lager şahidi Gulbahar bölümü. 2006 yıldan ta hazırgıçılık Fransa'da yaşap kelyapman. 2016 yılının ahiri ben Xitoy hükümetininki aldap çağırtışı bilen vatanga qaytib berip Xitoyninki vatanimizdeki Uyg'urlar üçün açkan tutup turuş merkezi ve ceza lagerlarda 3 yılga yaqin turdim. Saqchilar dastlabdan mening pasportimni tortib olib, ondan odam to'plab jamiyat tartibini buzgan degan töhmatga qo'l qo'yishga majburladi.
My name is Gulbahar Haitiwaji. Since 2006, I lived in France. At the end of 2016, I was lured back to China to do my pension retirement process. But after I went back to China, my passport was taken, and then they sent me to both detention camps as well as concentration camps for 3 years.
Ondan mening putumga kishanni silib, kamerga kirib so'libatdi. Bu yerdagi kamerdagi ayollarning ahvoli intayin ichinishlik, butun ayollarning putlari kishanlangan, ona tilimiz bo'lgan Uyg'ur tilida so'zlashimiz cheklangan.
First they shackled my feet and then they detained. The women's condition in the detention centers are horrible. All women are shackled, and our language of Uyghur will prohibit to speak.
Nölden tüven 20 neçe gradusluq soğukta şamaldatımız degen bana bilen saatlap taladı turguzub koyup qiynaytdi. Her qitim soraqa chiqqan vaqtida qo'limizni kaynichalab ko'yi silib, beshimizni qarxalti kiygizib, tömür o'rindiqqa put qo'limizni muqimlashtirib qo'yib turib so'ra qiladi.
In order to, with the name of taking us out from the cell and to see the fresh air, but in reality they torture us under 20 Celsius degrees, cold weather. And also they interrogate us from time to time. Each time they interrogate us, they put black hood to our head, and they shackle our feet, and they handcuff us. Then they took us to interrogation room, then let us sit in a tiger chair without moving condition, and then they start to interrogate.
2017 yılı 4. ayının 1. günü biz barlıq ayarlarını karvatqı zincirlap koydu. Ben 20 gün zincirleklik tutudum.
On 1st of April 2017, all women detainees were chained onto the bed. I was chained to the bed for 20 days.
Ceza lagerninki hem yerde kamera var. Bütün hareketimiz küzülüp durdu. Bir yerde bizge yılda 2 qitim zukamning oldini olimizda vaksina urdi. Vaksina urilgandan keyin ayollarning asosiyatdan odatlar to'xtab ketdi.
There are cameras all over the camp, every place. Every move was monitored. And twice a year they said they would administer a vaccination, but in reality after this vaccination all women's period has stopped.
Bu yerda men o'xshamagan ikki jazo lagerida turdim. Dastlabki turgan jazo lagerimda 17 yoshdan 70 yoshgacha 250 ga yaqin ayollar bordi. Bu jazo lageri texmi jiq odamni sig'dira olmaganligi uchun 2018-yili 10-oyning 18-kuni bizni yangidan silingan cho'ng bir jazo lageriga yo'tkidi. Mushu jazo lageriga ketgan mablag'ga qarablam Xitoyninki Uyg'urlarni sistemlik yo'qotish uchun tuzgan planlarninki qisqa muddatli plan emas, uzun muddatli plan ekanligini bilib olgan bo'ldi.
I spent two different types of concentration camps. The one was, there were detained from 17 years old to 70 years old people, and there were 250 persons. Then later, they have moved me to a different camp, which is, it happened on October 18, 2018. They took us to a new camp, but the building that new camp, to me, it costed huge. They invested a lot. From that new camp, I can imagine that the Chinese government systematic abuse against the Uyghurs is not something that is short-term plan. It is for long-term plan.
Bu yerda biz kuniga 11 soatlab sinfda o'tirib, Xitoyninki bizning kallamizni yuydigan tarix, qonun va xansu tili darslarini o'rganamiz. Haftada bir qizil naqsh o'rganamiz. Hafta oxirida bunga imtihon berdik.
We spent 11 hours in that camp to learn brainwashing education. It includes history, law, and also we have to sing red songs. And at the end of each week, and we have to test about what we have learned.
Bu yerda shu yangi lager kelgandan keyin bizni 2018-yili 11-oyning 5-kunidan boshlab 4 odamni bir guruh qilib turib, bizga sud ichib, bizga kesim e'lon qildi. Menga 7 yillik hukm e'lon qilgan.
In that new camp on November 5th, 2018, they organized a group of 4 people together, and then they start to bring us to trial. In that trial, they have sentenced me for 7 years jail.
Agar bizningki Uyg'ur tilida so'zlashganimizni bilib qolsa, bir ayrim so'laydigan bir uy bor, shu uyga 24 soat, 48 soat, hatto 72 soatlab so'lab qo'yib, tamoq suv bermaydi, to'mir o'rindiqqa putqulimizni muqimlashtirib qo'yib, toki biz men xato qilibman, men ikkinchi Uyg'urcha so'zlamayman deganga qadar so'lab qo'yadi.
If they find out that we spoke in Uyghur language, they would lock us in a separate room. They would leave us for 24 hours to until 72 hours and lock us into a tiger chair. And they keep us until we say that we're never going to speak in Uyghur language.
Xitoy hukumatı qayta tarbiyalaymiz degan bana bilan hech qanday gunohi yo'q bo'lgan ayollarni akirib shu yerga so'layotdi. Bu ayollarningki eng cho'ng gunohi bo'lsa, yog'liq atgan, namoz o'qib qo'ygan yoki bo'lmasa uyda Qur'on kitobini saqlagan, chet elda bolalar o'qiyotgan, chet elga sayohatga chiqqan odamlar. Bularning hech qaysi qayta tarbiyalanishga ehtiyoji yo'q bo'lgan doktorxonadagi doktorlar, maktabdagi muallimlar, bank xodimlari, yoki tijoratchilar, shundaqla pensiyaga chiqqan muqim kirimi bor bo'lgan ishchi xizmatchilar.
With the excuse of so-called re-education, the Chinese government actually detained most of the innocent people. The reason for detention was simply some people just wore a headscarf or kept the Quran in the house, or they have traveled to foreign countries, or they have connection with the foreign countries. And the detained people include just retired professionals and intellectuals.
2019-yili 3-oyning 12-kuni saqchilar meni bu jazo lageridan sharoit yaxshiroq bo'lgan bir yerga o'rlashtirdi. Bu yerda men bir odamni 3 er saqchi bilan 8 ayol saqchi kuzatdi. Bu yerdagi mening vazifam yaxshi yeyish, yaxshi uxlash, televizor ko'rish. Chunki men o'riqlab 50 kilogim yetmaydigan bo'lib qolgan. Agar Xitoy hukumatı meni shunday ahvol ostida Fransiyaga yo'lga qo'yib qo'ysa, Xitoylarningki shu Sharq Turkistonda jazo lagerlari yo'q degan nimalarga uyg'un kelmaydi, ham o'zlariniki shu yerda irqiy qirg'inchilik olib berayotganligi oshkorlanib qoladi.
March 13th, 2019, they have moved me to a little bit better conditioned detention facility. But at that facility, all I have to do was eat and rest. But that detention, I stayed under supervision or monitoring of 3 male guards and 8 female policemen. And they had to feed me well because I lost so much weight that my weight was less than 50 kilograms. That purpose was because after I go back to France, and they have to make sure that they want to prove that the denial of that I was detained in the concentration camps and there is genocide happening in East Turkestan. For that purpose, they feed me before they send me to France.
Ben 2019 yılı 8 ayının 21 günü Fransa hükümetindeki diplomatik aralashışı ve kızımdaki güç çıkarışı bilen Xitay'daki cezalagırdan kutulup Fransa'ya kelip aldım. Şu yerge kelişten burun sakçı başlığı menden şu ceza lagerlarda beşimden ötken közüm bilen köygenlerini chet elge chiqqandan hech qanday qadamga tinmasligimni agar oshkorlasam shu vatanda qolib qolgan urug' tuqqanlarimga xatar yetadiganligini deb turib manga tahdid solgan.
August 21st, 2019, I came to France with the help of my daughter's campaign and the French government's diplomatic involvement with the Chinese government. Before I came to France, the police the police boss told me that whatever I have witnessed in the concentration camp, I should not talk about it. If I do, they said they will retaliate against my family members back home, and they will, the consequence will be, my relatives will pay for the consequence.
Ben Fransa'ya çıkandan keyin özümün beşten ötken vakalarını kitap kılıp yazıp çıktım. Kitap 2021 yılı 1. ayının 13. günü neşirden çıktı. Kitap neşirden çıkandan keyin Xitay hükümeti meni terörçü dep e'lon qildi. Şu günden başlap mening vatandagi barliq urug' tuqqanlarim bilan bo'lgan aloqam uzildi. Hozirgachilik ular bilan hech qanday aloqam yo'q. Rahmat.
After I came to France, later I wrote my experience and my book was published January 13, 2021. After my book published, Chinese government accused me, said that I am a terrorist. Since then, I lost contact with my family. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. Ms. Sidik, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Assalamu alaikum, hürmetli hanımlar, efendiler. Ben ceza lager şahidi Qelbinur Sidik'ten sizlerge salamlar olsun. Ben 2017 yılı 3. aydan 9. aygacha vatanimiz Sharq Turkiston Urumchi shahri Sayvaq rayoni Tanfonga qurilgan mana bu erlar kampusida 6 ay Xitoy til darsi o'tishga majburlandim.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, my name is Qelbinur Sidik. I am a concentration camp witness. On March 9th, 2017, I was sent to the concentration camp, which is the picture shown in Sayvaq district, Urumchi, for 6 months.
Bu 4 qavatlik binanın tamның üstülleri bütünlüğü elektron tok sistemleri bilan qattiq qo'rshilgan. İchki va sirtida koridorlarda harbiy saqchilar qurolli holda xudosi jangga chiqilgandek holatda qo'g'dab turdi.
This is a 4-floor building. The walls are covered with razor wire, and around the building and inside the building, there are military, the policemen with the rifles. It looks like kind of war zone.
Tutqun erlarniki %90% 18 yaşdan 40 yaşgacha, faqat 10% 40 yaşdan yuqori ve 70 yaşlıqlar idi.
The detained male prisoners, the 90% of them are 17 years old to 40 years old male, but 10% is from 40 years old until 70 years old.
Tutqun erlar kamerlarda 30'dan 40'cha qisilishib turdi ve quruq simotning ustida yotadi.
In one cell, there are 30 to 40 prisoners detained, and also those detained sleeps on the cement floor.
Ular har kunligi tamaqaga bir taldan Xitoy momisi bilan quruq shogir suvi ichidi. Hatto 6 oy jarayonida bir vaqtda muncha kirib juyinib boqqani yo'q. Ular tuvaletlarga chiqish uchunmi vaqt belgilab berilgan.
For each meal, they eat 1 Chinese bun and water. And even going for toilet, it's monitored, and they had to spend designated time. And also, within 6 months, none of them had any shower.
Tutqun erler, putqollari mana shundaq zanjirlangan va kishanlangan holda kamerlardagi tam bilan eshikniki tutqishi zanjirlangan eshikdan 30 gradus ochilgan, o'milab chiqadi sinflarga, sinfdan o'milab kamera qaytadi.
Like this, the detainees chained and also shackled. The cell doors is 30 degrees kind of open, so they are unable to stand and walk out and into the cell. So they had to crawl out from the cell, and then they go to classrooms for re-education.
Mayli ders vaqtlari olsun, tushlik orom olish vaqtlari olsun, bu tutqun erlarning oldiga besilgan nomerlar orqali chaqirib achitilib, so'roqladi va so'roq jarayonida har xil qiyin qistoqlar olib borildi. Bu so'roq qilinadigan joy sinfninki yinidagi yarasi bo'lg'achqa, ular chaqirib chiqayotgandan keyin yarim soatdan keyin ularning ichinishlik ovozlari butun binoni zilzilaga soladi.
Whether the detainees are in the classroom or outside, they will call it by the number and then taken for interrogations. The interrogation rooms are located just next to the classes, not too far. So after 30 minutes that the prisoners were taken, and then you will hear horrible screaming sound from torture, because they are tortured while interrogating.
Ularni qiynashning 4 xil usuli bor. Yana elektronlik kaltak, elektronlik doppa, elektronlik palay va elektronlik tumur o'rindiq. Yani bu yo'lbos o'rin deb ataladi.
There are 4 types of torturing methods. One is electric button, electric helmet, electric glove, and a tiger chair.
So'roqdan keyin bu tutqunlar haftalab, hattoki oylab darsda qatnashamaydi.
After the interrogation, after the torture, those prisoners are unable to come to class for weeks or months.
2017'de 9-aydan 11-aygacha mayli shu vatanimizda Urumchi shahri, Sayvaq rayoni To'gunga qurilgan mana bu 6 qavatlik qiz ayollar kampasiga o'tkazdim.
From September till November 2017, I was moved to this 6th-floor building, which kept female prisoners. It located in To'gun, Urumchi.
Bu 6 qavatlik balkonsiz bino bo'lib, bu yerga 10 mingga yaqin qiz ayollar so'langan.
There is no balcony of these buildings. There are over 10,000 female prisoners were detained.
Tutqun qiz ayollarning sochlari butunlay tushirib etilgan, ustiga kulrang mahbus kiyimi kiygan, uning ustida obsil rangli jilidki bor, jilidkining ustida nomer besilgan.
The all female prisoners, the hair was shaved, and they were wearing grey uniform, and the top of them there is yellow vest, and on that vest there is a numbers. Those prisoners are only called by numbers.
Tutqun qiz ayollar har dushanba kunda noma'lum dori ichidi ularga, andan keyin hukul urdi va ulardan qon oldi.
Each Monday, the female prisoners will administer an unknown medicine and taken blood from them.
Tutqun qiz ayollarning 190% yana o'xshashlam 18 yoshdan 40 yoshgacha bo'lib, ular dori ichish jarayonida qiz ayollarning butunlay odatlari to'xtatib etilgan, hatto bola imitayotganlarning sutini to'xtab ketgan.
The 90% of the female prisoners are from 18 years old to 40 years old. After they take those medicines, the period will stop. Even some women who were breastfeeding the babies, the breast milk will stop after taking that medicine.
Texmi dehshat bo'lgani, bu qiz ayollar so'roq jarayonida Xitoy soqchilarining so'roq qilish orqali bularni bosqinchilik uchrab turdi, navbatlashib bosqinchilik qilish, hattoki qo'lidagi elektronlik kaltaklar bilan shu qiz ayollarning jinsiy maqsad yo'llariga qiynash olib bordi, tiqish orqali.
The horrible thing is, when those female prisoners were taken for interrogation, they face gang rape by the guards. And the worst thing is the guards or police use electric button to insert their private parts to rape and to torture them.
Ben şu yerdeki 18-20 yaş atrafında bir kızın cesedine şahit oldum. Yani bu kız özünün adı toxtumay qansırap 2 ayga yakın. 2 harbiy zambilde apmağını öz gözümde görgen.
And I have witnessed a 18 to 20-year-old girl's death. That girl's, the period didn't stop for 2 months. Because of bleeding, she passed away. I have witnessed that death of the girl.
Kampı işi olsun ve sırtı olsun, sırtıdakiler mi üstü uçuk türmelerde yaşaydı. Ular mı özününki mesul olan sakçıları ve ahali komite kadrlarının bana bu şunda kurtuluşları asasen doktorxanalarga berip üzük saldırıldı ve tuğmaslık operasyası kılındı.
The outside camp is no different from as well. It is like just an open prison. The outside the camp, the people will face the exactly same monitoring and sterilization. Like, for example, this is the policies that issued by the government. By these policies, many women need to forcibly insert IUDs and sterilized.
Ben 2019 yılı 5. ayının ahiri şu yerdeki Uyghur kız ayollarına okşaş, Ürümçi şehir, Tensar rayonu Çağlayan'a joylashgan. Mana bu doktorxonada mecburi tug'maslik operatsiyasi qilindi.
Just like many other women in my homeland, at the end of May 2019, I was sterilized in Changloyan Hospital in Tianshan District in Urumqi.
Bundan sırt yana Xitaylar 2017 yılı yolu koygan atalmış koşma Xitay ertuqanlarını şu yerdeki Uyghur ayollarına uyga mecbur ekiriş arkalı özünün uyida yani her xil şekilde depsençilik ve zoramanlık uçurap durdu.
And also China initiated another policy of becoming relatives with Chinese officials. And through that policy, the many Uyghur women face abuse, rape and humiliation on the Chinese officials at their own houses.
Mening ailemge mo shunda Xitoy qo'shmaq ertuqan o'rlashtirgan bo'lib, buningda Xitoy hukumatı ashlarga 5 bilib bo'lish prinsipini tushirpagan.
Even one of the Chinese officials were allocated to stay at my house. And there are 5 policies saying that the 5 together policy.
Yani bu 5 bilib bo'lish deganimiz, billa tamoq etish, billa tamoq yeyish, billa uyg'unish qilish, billa sayl qilish va billa yetish.
That 5 together is eat together, cook together, learn together, sleep together and sightseeing together.
Bu Xitoy tuqqan her ayda bir hafta uyda turdi ve tamoq etish jarayonida, tamoq yeyish jarayonlarida sizning qo'llaringizni, dumalaringizni silash orqali sen bek güzelkensen, tamoqing bek o'xshabdi, mana bizning qo'limizda 5 bilib bo'lish bor deb şu özümüzün uyida mana shunday depsanchilikdan olib bordi.
That the male, the Chinese official, communist official, while staying in the house, for example, at my house, they supposed to stay 1 week initially, and while staying, when I am cooking in the kitchen or doing something, that Chinese official would come just to relentlessly touch my all over the body. And would say, and by showing the paper saying that, look, in that policy saying that we can cook together, do things together, and then, with the excuse of praising me, how am I cooking, everything, and they try to touch me and abuse me, kind of humiliate me.
2018 yıldan başlap, yani vatanımız Şarkı Türkistan'da, mana şundak nurg'unlig'am qul zavodlari şekillendi. Buningda yani mecburi emgek, şu yerdeki kız ayollar, kampı lagerlardagilar bu yerde mecburi qul ishchi bo'lib ishlaydi.
From 2018, there appeared many slave factories. There are many detainees, the people who detained in the concentration camps forced to work in those slave factories.
Ben 2019 yılı 10. ayda Gollandiya garajdan olgan kızımninki zor tirishchanligi ve Özbek milleti bo'lg'achqa Gollandiyaga qochib keldim. Ammo yo'lishim Uyg'ur bo'lganligi uchun Xitoy soqchilari uni chiqishni qat'iy chekladi.
On October 2019, with the help of my Netherlands citizen daughter, I was able to escape to Netherlands. And because I'm Uzbek and I was able. However, because my husband, he's a Uyghur, Because of simply he's a Uyghur, he is unable to come to Netherlands with me.
2020 yılı 1. aydan başlap, ben şu tecavüzçü Xitaylarning vatanimizga bo'layotgan şu irqiy qirg'inchiligini bütün dünya ve xalqaroga anglitishga qadam qo'ydim ve Guardian, BBC, CNN chiqib ketgandan keyin Xitoy saqchilari mening vatanda qolgan tuqqanlarim ve yo'ldoshim orqali WeChat ichib menga tahdid qildi.
From January 2020, I start to speak out about the genocide that happening in my homeland. And my witness testimonies published in Guardian, BBC, and the CNN. After these publications, Chinese government used my husband and relatives' WeChat, and they contacted me.
Mana bu 2021 yılı 2. ayının 18 günü ettigen saat 9:30'da Ürümşehir Tensar rayonu Baxulang saqchixonasidagi Livinjang manga yo'ldoshim va adamning WeChat orqali ekran ochib, meni o'zi uchun xizmat qilishga majburladi. Men qo'shilmagandan keyin menga tahdid qildi.
This is a policeman from Baxulang in Urumqi. He used my husband and my sister's WeChat video and rang me on February 18, 2021. And he forced me to work for Chinese government, and I refused.
Yani 2021 yılı 6. ayda Angliya London'da içilgan Uyghur sotida bir gün burun vatanda qolgan şu yo'ldoshimni video ishlash orqali mening qolgan guvohligimning hammani yolg'onga chiqadi va bunga tirishdi. Undan keyin yana WeChat ekran ochish orqali yo'ldoshimni har xil eg'iz og'usiz tilxonatlar bilan tillab meni majburiy ajrashtiribdi va oilamni vayron qildi.
Just one day before that, the London Uyghur Tribunal happened, which is June 4th, 2021. Again, the Chinese police used my husband's WeChat and they reached out to me. And they used very abusive languages against me. And also, at the end, they forced me to divorce from my husband. And they tried to tell that whatever I say and all my testimonies are false. And with that, they destroyed my family.
Shundan e'tiboran ta hozirga qadar men vatanda qolgan tuqqanlarimning va shu yo'ldoshimning tirikmi, hayotmi, hech xabarim yo'q, aloqam butunlay uzilgan. Hammanglarga rahmat.
Since then, I lost contact with my family members, including my husband. I'm not sure whether my husband is still alive or not. Thank you.
I've been here over 6 years now, not as long as some, but I've never heard such powerful personal testimony. So thank you for your bravery in speaking, in standing up to the Chinese Communist Party, and thank you for entrusting us with your stories. It's an honor. Without objection, I would like to now invite Representative Steele to engage in a colloquy with one of our witnesses to further discuss their firsthand experiences of the CCP's genocide, to be followed by a colloquy with Representative Carson. Representative Steele, you are now recognized for a 5-minute colloquy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, witnesses. You guys are very much courageous coming out, and you are just not let us know, but you are letting American peoples know that what CCP does. So I'm just so grateful. Human rights abuse is happening at the hands of CCP should horrify every one of us. We cannot allow what they are doing to fly under the radar. The CCP is committing genocide against Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minorities like Muslims and Christians. We cannot be silent. The CCP is the greatest threat to democracy. Today, that means exposing the CCP for who they are and ensuring the world hears your stories. Thank you for coming out. And my own family fled from North Korea, from communism. I heard about it, and I had 2 ladies actually came from Uyghur. They had the labor camp experiences, and they talked about it before they go in. Before they go to the prison, they actually scan your organs. So when you have healthy organs, the CCP is harvesting those organs and they're selling it. So they are doing organ harvesting. But you know what? When I read your stories, it's just it's horrifying. It's much worse than what I heard. So I just want to ask you, Ms. Sidik, that you had experiences in those labor camps. Could you tell us a little more about that, how the CCP has been treating Uyghur children in the camp? And I think you saw those people there.
Şu yerdə qurulğan iki çoğun qul zavodiga mən özüm bağlan. Bunun birinci qul zavodi Ürümçi Tensa rayonu Xongyanlu degan yerga joylashgan. Chunki bu yerda mening xizmatda yo'ldoshim o'sha yerda xizmat qildi, cho'ng bir shirkat bu. Mushu yerga 2018-yili Qashqa Aqto'dan 114 Uyg'ur yosh qiz yigit yo'tkab kelingan.
Personally, myself, I have been to 2 slave factories. Those factories were located in Tianshan, Xongyanlu, Urumqi. And it's kind of big company. And in 2018, this factory brought many young Uyghurs from Aqto, Qashqar.
Chunki yo'lishimdanki Xitoy stas yaxshi bo'lganligi uchun o'sha yerda menga telefon echib, shu yerdagi zavod boshliqlari bilan shu kelgan qo'l ishchilarlar to'xtam tuzmoqchi ekan, bular 10 necha turlik. Shu to'xtamning tarjimasini men qilib bergan Xitoycha ham Uyg'urcha. Shuning uchun endi esimda qolgan.
I remember that incident very clearly because since my husband's Chinese is not good, he doesn't have good Chinese skills, so he needed to talk to the workers, and they had to make a contract between the factory and the workers. So I personally involved in making that contract. That contract was both in Chinese and Uyghur, so that's why I know.
Undan keyin ikkinchi yana cho'ng qul zavodi Urumqi shahar Badavanga joylashgan sanoat rayoni. Bu yerga 300 dan 500 gacha qiz yigitlar ishlaydi.
And another slave factory was located in Badawan. There are from 300 to 500 young girls and boys work there.
Andan keyin men shu vatimiz Sharq Turkiston Urumqi shahrida boshlang'ich maktabda 28 yil Xitoy tili dars o'qituvchisi bo'ldim. Bu kamp lagerlar qurilgandan keyin shu suyumlik narsada o'quvchilarimning intayin dashtiga ta hozir qadar unutmaydim.
I worked as a teacher for an elementary school in Urumqi for 28 years. Until today, I am unable to forget the young innocent students that I have.
Chunki 2016-yil oxiridan boshlab shu o'quvchilarimizning dadisi, opasi va yoki butun tuqqanlar tutib ekitilgan bo'lg'achqa, bular doim bizdan savol so'raydi. Muallim, nima uchun meni opam tutib ekitdi yoki dadamni yoki tog'amni deb mushaq savollarni so'raydi. Bu savollarga men javob berishga ojiz edim.
From the end of 2016, the children, the students in my classroom, they start to ask, teacher, why my parents are taken? Why my uncle are taken? Because there are many parents who are taken, separated from the children. And I was unable to answer that questions because it's very painful.
Lekin shunda olsam o'zimni zo'rg'a berib, bisib ularga tasalli berdim. Balam, hukumat ularni davlat tili o'rganishga akatdi. Sen xotirjam bo'l, cho'qim qaytib keladi deb. Yana necha kundan keyin ular yana davomli mendan so'raydi. Ma'lum nima uchun bizdek maktabda turib o'qimaydi ular deb. Demak, ta hozir qadar meni yurgimdan azoblaydigini shu o'quvchilarimdan javobsiz qolgan shu savollari.
But I had to explain them differently. I would tell them that, you know what, your parents had to learn national language. That's why they were taken. But the kids were unable, they didn't satisfy with that. They said, if they had to learn the language, why would they not learn the language, the school that we are in right now? Until today, I feel the extreme pain that I wasn't able to give them the satisfactory answer.
u yerda yana shu o'quvchilarniki bolalar kampusi, yasli kampuslar ta'sis qilindi. Unda atalmış yataqliq maktab degan bilan amaliyotda kamplar.
Since then, there is children's camp start to appear. Like it's the name called it's kindergarten or boarding school, but in reality, it was a camps for the children.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm going to just submit a few more questions in writing, so because my time is up, so I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carson, you're now recognized for a 5-minute colloquy.
Thank you so very much, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy. Ramadan Mubarak. I extend a warm welcome to the witnesses. I thank you both, and I thank you all for working together to make this happen. First, our committee recognizes the very unique and irreplaceable Uyghur people and the right to practice your faith and your faiths, to celebrate your culture and your language, and to pass it down to your children. Your testimony is so very powerful, and we thank you for your bravery in coming here today telling your stories. Ms. Haitiwaji, thank you again, and thank you, Ms. Sidik. You talk about the indoctrination that you've endured, both of you. We know the CCP's attempt to marginalize and systematically erase people's cultures and beliefs is a form of oppression. Can you elaborate on how this made you feel as a Uyghur woman and its impact on the community and its implications going forward, and what the global community has to do to bring a change?
Ben ceza lagerida turayotgan vaqtimda bizga kuniga 11 soatlab qonun, tarix, Xitoy tili darslarini o'tadi. Uning keyindan mushu o'tilgan darslarning hammani biz cho'qim yodlashimiz kerakdi. Hatto oxirida imtihon berdik.
While I was in the camp, there are 11 hours brainwashing lesson on daily basis. The lessons include Chinese law, history, and the Chinese language. And also we had to memorize everything. And also we have to test after learning all of them.
Biz butunlay shu partiya hukumatni kuylaydigan qizil naqshlarni haftada bir naqshi o'rganamiz, bundan hafta oxiri imtihon beramiz.
And also we have to learn songs that praising Chinese Communist Party and the government. And again we have to test at the end of the week.
Ondan biz kundalik xatira yozishga majburlandik. Biz shu lagerga berib bir 2-3 oydan keyin bu kundalik xatiraga biz o'zimizningki yurak so'zlarimizni yozamaymiz, faqat mushu partiya hukumatning bizni turmalarga olmay shu maktabda o'qitish fursatini berganligiga rahmat aytamiz. Faqatla partiya hukumatning yaxshiligini bizga bergan shu kunlar, shu esil yaxshi kunlarga rahmat aytdik.
And also we have to write daily description or expression about our thoughts. And that thoughts shouldn't be genuine, and that should be just including praising the government and authority, that thank them that we will not take into prison, rather we will send to the re-education to learn. We have to be grateful for that we're not sent to prison.
Her günü sınıfga kirgan vaqtimizda tamoq yeyishdan burun partiya ulug' vatanimizga rahmat, Jungo Kommunistik partiyasiga rahmat, Xi Jinping'e rahmet deyttik. Dersten düşkende tamaktan keyin bu üççüge tilek dileyttik.
Before eating, we have to praise or say that we are grateful to country, we are very grateful for China's Communist Party, and we are grateful for Xi Jinping. And after finish eating, again, we have to praise them and thank them.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm out of time. I'll submit questions for the record. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carson. Thank you both, again, for your powerful testimony. I now invite our other witnesses to join Ms. Haitiwaji and Ms. Sidik at the witness table. Well, in the interest of time, as the logistics get ironed out here, we'll start with the introductions. We're fortunate tonight to hear from three witnesses with deep expertise about the CCP's genocide of the Uyghur people. They will help us understand the scale and scope of the CCP's genocide, how it fits within the party's broader strategy and vision for the future, and they'll help us think through what we can do in response. First, we have Dr. Adrian Zenz, a senior fellow and director of China Studies for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He's a leading scholar on the Uyghur Genocide, and his analysis of leaked Chinese government documents, including the China cables and the Xinjiang papers, played a paramount role in bringing these atrocities to light. Thank you for being here. We're also very privileged to have Chair Nury Turkel, chair of the U.S. Commission on International Freedom. Mr. Turkel is also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and co-founder and chair of the Uyghur Human Rights Project. He is himself Uyghur, and he is one of the foremost advocates for the Uyghur people. And finally, we're grateful to have Ms. Naomi Kikoler, director of the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Museum. She is a powerful advocate for all genocide victims, and we're grateful for her perspective, particularly from a historical angle. Now, let me recognize before I swear in the witnesses, we've asked them to do something impossible because of the unique sort of format here, and in the interest of time, to limit their remarks to 2 minutes, which really is unfair. I just want to commend that their written testimony was absolutely exceptional, but we're hoping to tease out what you can't say in your very, very unfairly short statement through the question and answer. But we thank you for bearing with us. The hour is late, but the subject is very important, and we appreciate your help. So thank you again. If you could, the three of you could please stand and raise your right hand. I'll now swear you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may be seated. Let the record show that the additional witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Each of our new witnesses will now have 2 minutes for their opening remarks. Dr. Zenz, you may begin.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, these witness statements we've heard do not speak of isolated incidents. They reflect a systematic policy. Classified documents outline Beijing's secret plan to subjugate the region. Xi Jinping himself asked Chen Quanguo, experienced with crushing dissent in Tibet, to move to Xinjiang to execute his plan, which began in 2017 with mass internments and ran for 5 years initially. Xinjiang detained an estimated 1 to 2 million ethnic group members in reeducation camps and implemented measures to prevent births, leading to unprecedented declines in Uyghur birth rates. The presumed goal of these measures and the intent behind them was to optimize the ethnic population structure, diluting Uyghur populations with Han because concentrated Uyghur populations are considered a national security threat. According to secret speeches by Xi Jinping in 2014, suppressing ethnic resistance in Xinjiang is paramount for achieving the CCP's major 21st century goals. Genocide research says that preventative internment targeting an entire ethnic group is a sign of political paranoia. Political paranoia is an exaggerated threat perception that genocide scholars have linked to all major atrocities in the past 100 years. This paranoia is well worth studying because it also informs the CCP's stance towards everything else, including the United States. Policy Recommendation 1 The US government should sanction implicated current and former central government officials. My written testimony contains a list. So far, the US has not sanctioned a single central government official, even though they are implicated. Having determined genocide in Xinjiang, second, the government should spell out how it will follow through on its treaty obligation to prevent the crime of genocide. Third, the government should establish measures to prevent US investors, such as pension funds, to invest in Chinese entities implicated in human rights violations, surveillance, and military modernization. Thank you.
That was very well done in 2 minutes. Chair Turkel, you are now recognized for 2 minutes.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, members of the committee. I'm truly grateful for your leadership in addressing, prioritizing the Uyghur genocide. The picture that we're looking at and been hearing is bleak. Millions of Uyghur people are still suffering, and the death count is still unknown. The Chinese government, as noted earlier today, using high-tech tools like biometric scanning, using forced collection of DNA, iris scans, face scans, and voice prints, combined with mobile phone tracking apps, massive network surveillance cameras, the CCP has mobilized AI machine learning for its total control regime. Congress must also ensure full enforcement of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. This bill requires global Magnitsky sanction on all entities and officials responsible for the atrocities. To date, only 12 Chinese officials and entities currently under GlobalMac sanctions. This is a pitiful response. We need GlobalMac sanctions on all the Chinese high-tech giants that are maintaining genocide that tech built. Making these companies no-go zone is long overdue. I urge this committee to focus on China's transnational repression. It is past time to strengthen government authorities to defend US sovereignty and civil liberties under our Constitution. Tonight, I will speak only to my own case as a Uyghur American. Chinese officials have continued to prevent me from seeing my mother, despite involvement by senior officials, including Secretary Blinken and Ambassador Burns. It is extremely painful to say this, but it is unlikely that I will see my mother again in this life. In fact, my father, and I said goodbyes along with my mother at the time, that when the Chinese government, CCP, started rounding up Uyghur intellectuals and families with foreign contacts. My late father even told me that he wished he died earlier so that he could left this world with good memories. I urge the committee to address China's massive program of state-imposed forced labor that we can discuss a little bit later. Tonight, you have heard from two brave women. I salute the courage of these two ladies that I call friend, as well as other survivors who borne witness from the inside camps. I have 27 recommendations that you can look at. In closing, I wanted to thank the committee. Crimes against humanity cannot be treated merely as an area of disengagement or disagreement, worse yet, an irritant in a bilateral relationship. This is truly more than a competition. It is a battle for the world, and our children will inherit it. Genocide is defined as an international crime for a reason. Confronting is not an option. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Kikoler, you're recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher and Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, for holding this important hearing today and for shedding a light on the plight of the Uyghur people. Mr. Chairman, I ask that my full statement on the museum's 2021 report to make us slowly disappear be entered into the record, in addition with pictures and stories of Uyghurs speaking in interviews with the museum about the unknown fate of their family members.
Without objections, ordered.
The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum seeks to do for community today what was not done for the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. The words "never again" were meant to be a lasting commitment, no matter how challenging, including when a superpower like China is perpetrating the crimes. When most people think of genocide, they think of places like Auschwitz-Birkenau, where over 1 million Jews were systematically killed. The Chinese government is using subtler tactics to intentionally destroy the Uyghur people: mass surveillance and detention, torture, transfer of children, separation of men and women, and restrictions on reproductive capacity. These are crimes that impact all, but women in particular, who for too long have been overlooked as the intentional targets of genocide. The Chinese government is failing in its legal obligations to prevent genocide. What then does upholding "never again" mean in this context? First and foremost, the Chinese government must halt its crimes, release detainees, and allow unfettered access to independent monitors in Xinjiang. The scale of the crimes against the Uyghurs is daunting, and we know that confronting the crimes of a powerful perpetrator will be difficult. The United States alone cannot prevent these crimes. We must work with other governments, Uyghur civil society, and the private sector to develop swift, coordinated, and a global strategy to protect the Uyghur community. Thus far, no such strategy exists. For more than a decade, it has been official U.S. policy that preventing mass atrocities and genocide is a core national security interest and a core moral responsibility. To live up to this commitment, 3 prongs must minimally be pursued. First, degrade the capacity of perpetrators to commit further atrocities, for example, via expanding and strengthening enforcement of financial sanctions, targeting commercial entities that are supporting China's repressive policies, and export controls on advanced technologies. 2, persuade perpetrators to stop committing atrocities, for example, by promoting accountability, including through the creation of an independent, impartial, investigative mechanism to collect, preserve, and analyze evidence. And 3, protect Uyghurs outside China, for example, by providing asylum and refuge from transnational repression. In conclusion, this is our moment to abide by values that the American people hold dear. This is our moment to abide by U.S. strategic interests. On visiting the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, people often ask themselves, what would I have done had I been alive during the Holocaust? Let history guide us today so that we ask, now that I know what the Chinese government is doing to the Uyghurs, what will I do? This is our never again moment. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. In Ms. Haitiwaji's written statement, she writes, please stop pension fund investments in China's high-tech surveillance companies. I was shocked to learn that Americans are pouring their money into Dahua, Hikvision, Huawei, Tencent, and others that we are familiar with as being the power behind the Chinese state's heavy hand over our lives. And Dr. Zenz, in your written testimony, you write, quote, in their endeavor to capture Chinese markets and boost their bottom lines, American corporations have increasingly supported Beijing's military modernization, surveillance state, domestic securitization, and attendant human rights violations. Dr. Zenz, can you elaborate on what this support looks like on a day-to-day basis?
Thank you. Through mutual funds, for example, American investors are investing in a broad range of Chinese companies, and the US private sector is involved in aiding Chinese efforts. In terms of the US private sector, we have a lot of technology benefit with American companies doing research together for some extent, or providing the technology, for example, Intel chips powering cloud computing services in Urumqi that are being used for surveillance and public security and all kinds of other measures. There was a lot of co-development of technology. A lot of that has abated because of the geopolitical situation, but not all of it. It's a big research topic, and a lot of it is unknown or not known. And American money is funding a lot of Chinese companies. A lot of that is dual use, so you have companies that are, Chinese companies that are developing technology and products and solutions that work both for the civilian sector and also for the military sector. These topics are severely under-researched, and our current knowledge on these implications and complicities is inadequate.
Thank you. Chair Turkel, similar question. In your written statement, I was struck when you noted that numerous publicly traded Chinese tech companies are included in many emerging market indexes that are held by public pension funds, university endowments, individual retirement plans, and investment portfolios. What role does American capital play in subsidizing the ongoing genocide? And should tax-advantaged entities like pension funds or university endowments continue to enjoy that status if they are invested in, even if passively, companies that contribute to the genocide?
Chairman Gallagher, that's an important question acting on that issue is long overdue. This is happening two ways. The American people, us consumers, continue to fuel this genocide through our purchase of the tainted products. We're talking about more than 80 global brands. At the same time, as you eloquently pointed out in the last hearing, that we are investing in not only self-destruction, but also fueling this genocide, the ongoing genocide that is in its 7th year. Genocide should never happen, let alone being continued for 7 years. And also, this is very un-American, that corporate America, as you may recall, when the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act being considered, late 2021, U.S. Chamber of Commerce and others were opposing. They lobbied against. That has to stop. What we can do is to not only put them in a reputational risk category, we need to create criminal consequences for them. Just like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that considers corrupt practices as a criminal act that is handled through law enforcement at the SEC and at the Justice Department. So unless you make it difficult, enhancing some legal tools and making it not only immoral and reputational risk for them, but also face consequences, then we might be able to stop this. It's un-American, it's immoral, it's unconscionable practice that is still ongoing.
Just a quick follow-up specifically on the university endowments and pension funds and tax-advantaged entities. Should they enjoy that status? That they continue?
They should not enjoy that status.
Thank you, sir. And with that, I yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Dr. Zenz, I'd like to start our discussion with the growth of these mass concentration camps of Uyghurs. These so-called, quote-unquote, vocational education and retraining centers in Xinjiang started in 2014 and expanded dramatically in 2017. First, I just want to start with a graphic of a parcel of land in Xinjiang in 2015. As you can tell, it's an empty piece of land. But let's see what happened to this very tract of land. In 2017, CCP told the police to, quote, round up everyone who should be rounded up, close quote. And 1 year later, in 2018, a new internment camp was constructed on this previously empty site, correct, Dr. Zenz?
Yes, that is. Yes, along with many others. This particular facility is a detention center, which are extensively used for extrajudicial re-education, besides the so-called vocational skills training education centers, which were also erected from 2017.
Right. Let me show you a picture of some satellite imagery from 2020 of the same piece of land. Over 2 years, we see an enormous growth of this same camp, multiplying in size, manifold. Interestingly, in 2019, Chinese officials in Xinjiang stated that the forced internment centers were closed and that the detainees had all, quote unquote, graduated. Dr. Zenz, do these camps look closed to you?
The Chinese government was referring to the closure of so-called vocational skills education and training centers, which are lower security facilities, such as the one in Konasher, where we have evidence from the Xinjiang police files. All of these, the lower security camps were run just like detention centers as prisons, and we have testimony from them. What we see in 2019 a desecuritization of a number of the lower security vocational centers. That's how they're called, but they are re-education camps. And a drastic, as you correctly point out here, a significant expansion of higher security facilities. We have a trend, and we have some witness accounts of Uyghurs being shifted from the re-education facilities both into forced labor and into higher security prison. And we can assume that hundreds of thousands have been shifted into these facilities, which have been dramatically expanding.
Let me turn your attention to another very disturbing topic. In your 2020 report on the CCP's campaign to suppress Uyghur birth rates in Xinjiang, you included this chart, which shows sterilizations for every 100,000 people in Xinjiang compared to the nation as a whole. And what you can see in this chart, you can see it up there as well, but essentially the sterilization rate for Xinjiang region is much lower from 2010 to 2015 compared to what it is for the nation from 2010 to 2015. But then in 2016, the one-child policy ends, the sterilization rate goes down for the nation and it explodes for Xinjiang region. Now, my question to you is this. Dr. Zenz, when a government institutes a massive coerced forced sterilization program like this, it's not reflective of a government trying to provide vocational training or career training to this population, is it?
No, it's not. And in
It's a
fact,
si- it's
vocational
a-
training is just a euphemism.
It's a sign that this government, the CCP, no longer wants these people or their children to exist. Isn't that right?
The intent behind mass sterilization is to reduce Uyghur birth rates, to dilute the Uyghur population, which is seen as a national security threat. Concentrated Uyghur populations are considered a national security threat.
And this is ending Uyghur births, in some sense, fits the definition of a genocide, right?
Yes, the prevention of births is one of the articles of the Genocide Convention from 1948.
Mr. Turkel, thank you. Mr. Turkel, this morning the CEO of TikTok, Mr. Chu, was questioned at a hearing before Congress. And at that time, actually, my colleague, Dr. Dunn, cited reports of basically TikTok data being used to surveil Forbes journalists. And Mr. Chu said this was not spying on those journalists. Can you please tell us your opinion about what he said?
Well, that's what they do. When you look at their practices, starting from ByteDance. ByteDance has a strategic partnership with Chinese Ministry of Public Security. That's part of their business conduct. When you look at the way that they built this camp system, initially they relied on something called Integrated Joint Operating Platform. That joint operating platform used the data from the WeChat and Douyin to build
Douyin is the
Chinese
equivalent
version of the TikTok. Yes. So that's, a lot of Uyghur people to this day don't even know why they're in the camp, why their loved ones in the camp, because of this platform, tracing are part of the Chinese government. Even today, their representatives in Washington engaging in genocide denial. If you listen to the interview with the top lobbyist for the company last year with Jake Tapper on CNN, he could not even acknowledge that there's a genocide in China. That speaks the volume.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. The past two administrations and Congresses have formally designated the CCP's atrocities against the Uyghur people as genocide and crimes against humanity. And when we fail to confront the face of evil, that is the CCP, and the genocide is still underway, then our job is unfinished. The CCP, I believe, bears full responsibility for the terrible suffering of the Uyghur people, and they must be held accountable. To date, we've levied a variety of different tools against the CCP in response to these human rights violations. We've had targeted sanctions, we've had export controls and import restrictions. However, I would argue that none of these measures have in any way, shape, or form affected the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. These have been ineffective and insufficient. It hasn't changed the CCP's calculus towards Xinjiang. My question to the panelists is, what further actions must we take to truly alter Beijing's decision-making? How do we also raise this profile in the international community? Because this is of the magnitude where it has to be the United States and our friends and allies around the world. Please give us your perspective on how we heighten the sense of urgency on this issue and how we bring to bear the forces necessary to confront this evil.
Thank you, Representative Whitman, for that question. I'll briefly start. I think it's an incredibly important point. To respond to the level of threat that is currently facing the Uyghur people, we need a global and coordinated strategy, and that has been missing thus far. There needs to be greater coordination for the targeted sanctions that exist and also the import restrictions. There should be a process by which we are also, in the U.S. context, evaluating the efficacy of the measures that have already been put in place. The Director of National Intelligence could be tasked, for example, to collect intelligence specifically to that and to share that with respective parties. We can also be working to share intelligence with other governments to help share and create a like-minded approach to what needs to be done. We also believe that it's very important for there to be, much as has been stood up in the context of Ukraine, Burma, Syria, an independent investigative mechanism or a commission of inquiry to look into the crimes that are currently being perpetrated by the Chinese government. That information will help put a spotlight, but also, to your point, mobilize the will of others to act together to try to save these people's lives. I'll turn it over to Nury.
A couple of thoughts on this. One is a global aspect. For example, European countries in EU, Germany, Italy, for example, need to step up to the plate. They can, and countries as Naomi pointed out, Canada, UK, and others that have a similar type of legal tools as we do, such as Global Magnitsky Act, they need to use it. And also domestically, as I noted in my opening remarks, Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act need to be fully implemented. To date, we only went after 10, we announced 10 Global sanctions. That should be expanded to the banks for financial transactions. That should be expanded to the network. We also need to put pressure on the business community, the high-tech community, Silicon Valley to be exact. They're finding ways to still sharing technology, still providing hardware, software support. We need to close the loopholes, and this committee can do that.
Thank you. Dr. Zenz?
The key is to impose a cost for evil doing. Otherwise, it will not stop. And there's no guarantee that the cost will change the course, but it's the best strategy we have. Firstly, there has to be a personal cost paid by those perpetrating. There have to be sanctions, more sanctions, not just on Chen Quanguo, but there have to be sanctions on government officials in Beijing who are now directly implicated with internal evidence. Secondly, besides personal cost, there has to be a national cost. The national cost for the CCP is the economic sanctions related to forced labor. Work is done, but things need to be tightened, and products are still entering our country that shouldn't. And third, there has to be a reputational cost for committing genocide, and that requires, in my opinion, besides the multilateral approach and more pressure at the UN, I think the United States can be actually more strategic in the way it works with other countries at the UN in Geneva. But I think the administration also needs a stronger public communication for the American public. There needs to be much more engagement with the American domestic public.
Thank you, Dr. Zenz. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlemen, time expired. Ms. Castor is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ramadan Mubarak. First of all, I'd like to thank Ms. Haitiwaji and Ms. Sidik for sharing your very courageous stories. Your willingness to tell your stories of the atrocities inflicted upon the Uyghur by the CCP is helping the world understand what is really happening, especially as very few Uyghurs have been able to leave China. The genocide of the Uyghurs at the hands of the CCP has also been referred to as the largest incarceration of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust. The CCP's policies in the region have been disproportionately perpetrated against women, causing an outsized impact to Uyghur culture. Rape, forced sterilization, ripping families apart, ripping children away from their parents. And because of this, it's imperative that the Uyghur women's voices are included from the beginning. So I do appreciate the chair and the ranking member making that happen here tonight. Ms. Kikoler, how can this committee help amplify the Uyghur women's voices and experiences? You said we need a global and coordinated strategy. What role, how can we elevate the women's experiences to tell their stories and change what's happening?
Thank you so much, Representative Castor, for that question. I think it's really important what you're doing, first and foremost, in actually putting and drawing attention to the fact that the manner in which the Chinese government is perpetrating these crimes really singles out and focuses on the experiences of women. The conception of genocide consists of a number of different pillars, but within them include specifically imposing measures that would restrict birth, transferring children, and also other measures that would cause bodily harm. And we know from the history of the Holocaust that unfortunately it can be very difficult to understand the real nature of crimes that are occurring. That can be due to taboos around talking about sexual violence. It can be due to the difficulties in accessing witnesses and survivors. And it's really critical, as you are doing right now, that you're explaining the way in which these crimes are being perpetrated so that people understand, but that also so that government leaders in Beijing know that the world is watching and is aware that what they are doing behind closed doors, what they are doing within these camps, is something that the world is aware of, thanks to the incredibly courageous efforts of the two women beside us and of so many others that are telling their story. I think that there is additional support that could be provided to survivors who have been able to leave. It is very difficult for people to leave China and seek refuge elsewhere, but there are people whose stories need to be told. We need to actually have a process in place to collect in a systematic way their testimony, to gather their evidence. We've made great strides, sadly, as a result of contemporary genocides that have been perpetrated where women have also been targeted, be that the victims of the ISIS-related crimes, the victims of the Tatmadaw crimes in Burma against the Rohingya. We've developed ways in which we can interview survivors of gender-based violence and sexual violence in a trauma-sensitive manner. But what we haven't done in this particular case is specifically gone ahead with supporting those documentation efforts, supporting Uyghur civil society doing that, or creating an international mechanism for doing it. So a very big way that we could support women right now is in making sure that their stories are told to help create a historical record, but also advance accountability. And then, of course, through providing refugee assistance, through asking governments in neighboring countries to protect Uyghur communities so that they are not sent back to China to face future crimes, and so that we can also work to protect those who are speaking out. People like Rushan Abbas, whose sister sadly was taken after she spoke out about her experiences. So I think there are a number of different steps that can be taken to specifically help women, and I applaud you for putting an emphasis on that particular issue. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask Ms. Sitnik and Ms. Haitiwaji to answer for the record, to help us highlight the role of women and what specifically can be done to elevate their stories and have us take action. And I'll yield back.
Great, thank you. Mr. Luketemar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for your compelling testimony and sacrifice to be here and all the background you're giving us this evening. It's very, very vital to us. One of the numbers that has come across my desk is that in order for the Chinese Communist Party, i.e. government, to continue to oppress their people, to surveil them, detain them, and put them in detention camps, it takes about $300 billion a year. Is that a figure that you've heard before, could verify at all? Dr. Zenz, perhaps? Mr. Turkel? Is it close? Do you have an idea?
I think that figure is close. Here's why I think it's a reasonable number. When you look back, the time that they start building those over 400 camps and installing those cameras, they invested zillions of dollars. And now that's become a political economy. This is why they've been aggressively exporting their digital surveillance equipment. We're talking about more than 80 countries around the world, that include some democratic nations, adopting the Chinese surveillance. And also the exportation of slave labor-produced products, also part of their political.
You made my point. Thank you very much for that. The point is that it takes billions of dollars a year for them to do this. And where do they get the money from? This is a concern, and in your testimony, Mr. Turkel, you indicate and name names, which thank you for that, because I think it's time we start naming names of companies that do business, companies that fund these people and companies that are engaging and supporting this type of activity. You name Vanguard, BlackRock, HSBC, Fidelity, and other pension funds. I can tell you from being on the Financial Services Committee, the CEO of BlackRock recently made the comment that the best place to invest the next 20 years is China. That can't happen. But it is happening. And those guys should be responsible, as you just said a while ago, for that sort of activity. So by naming those folks, how are they getting those dollars into these different companies over there that are helping with the atrocities?
They raise funds. One of those companies in the midst of pandemic was bragging about raising $140 million in China, just China alone. Ray Dalio, he was publicly acknowledging that his business is thriving. And also hedge funds, venture capitalist firms in Silicon Valley are still making zillions of dollars.
You know, one of the things back in 2020, there were 1,000 Chinese companies on our stock exchange. And then we invested, United States invested $1 trillion in those companies.
Right.
$1 trillion. We put in place a provision that said they had to be audited every 2 years, because many of them are shell companies, and they're just running the money through those companies into the government. And that alone knocked almost 3/4 of those companies off the list. So as of January 9th, that list is 252. But we're still investing in the company, in this country. Our trade deficit's $383 billion. That's enough to keep the government funded to be able to detain and oppress their own people. How do you get the message across the American people that we've got to stop looking to Chinese products? We've got to start looking for our own, be willing to pay an extra $1 or $2 or $10, whatever it is, for an American-made product or a product made somewhere else in the world versus that of a Chinese-produced product.
Borrowing a quotable line from Undersecretary Silvers, I believe forced labor is a cancer on value. American people need to stop purchasing knowingly. Now everything we touch, solar panels, pharmaceuticals, PPEs, beauty products. As you may have seen, CNN reported the Uyghur woman hair products being sold. 13 tons of hair products were seized by the CBP. How many shipments did we miss? What else that I've been sending? And they label these products as black gold. People need to know that we are complicit in the ongoing genocide.
One quick more question. I notice you come in here with the International Finance Corporation, which is a development arm of the World Bank. It allows China access to their funds. And technically, in order to be able to do that, they are supposed to be a developing nation, which they are no way that they're there at this point. How would you suggest us to fix that problem?
The World Bank and IFC have been funding entities that are building those camps. Years ago,
they are funding the entities that are directly building these camps. Is that
there is an entity called XPCC, Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, that were using funds from the World Bank. There were hearings held in the United States Congress years ago. People didn't pay attention to it. And this is the entity that the US government sanctioned on the Global Magnitsky Act, and also largely responsible for the ongoing forced labor practices.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. And I commend the fireside chat you did with Undersecretary Silver. It's available in podcast form. It's good listening. Mr. Moulton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first I want to thank the witnesses for being here, for your bravery in speaking out. You've given us some of the most powerful testimony I've ever heard in my life. And it should not be lost on any of us that this genocide is happening today, not at some distant time in history. It's happening on our generation's watch. Mr. Zenz, you spoke in your testimony about the paranoia of Xi Jinping and the CCP being a driving factor behind this repression. I can only imagine two fundamental reasons that the CCP and Xi might undertake this quest to control, subdue, and ultimately eliminate Uyghurs. One is out of fear for the impact that this might have on his hold on power and his strategic goals for China. The second is out of some ethno-nationalist urge for China to be purely Han Chinese. To what degree are each of these at play here?
The CCP is profoundly insecure in the face of competing ideologies. It is a totalitarian system. So the important thing to recognize is that the worldview of the CCP is an ideology where its own ideology has to be dominant in every citizen. And there are two strategies for that. There's firstly ideological assimilation and second ethnocultural or racial assimilation. And with ethnic groups such as the Uyghurs, you have both problems. You have the problem that they're ethnically different and so harder to control. There's a religion, different language, culture at play. So assimilation is one important aspect of this fear complex. But the other one is the loyalty, the inner loyalty. And that's why in the re-education camps, they learn to give thanks and they simulate the prayer before meals or the singing before meal by giving thanks to Xi Jinping and the CCP for giving me food before they consume the meager ration they get in the camp. In my opinion, what happened in Xinjiang is the Uyghurs were the ones who really challenged the CCP's ability to control a region. And they realized at the end of the day, because the loyalty of the Uyghurs is not primarily to the Chinese Communist Party and the government, therefore every Uyghur is a potential threat. And I think that's how that expanded. If you look at it, initially there were 4 types of people to be targeted for re-education. Later on there were 21 types of Uyghurs to be targeted for re-education. If you look at the psychology of how a mass atrocity happens, it's basically a desire for a security that's unattainable because you can't control a human soul. That desire and the fear to not be able to do it spiral out of control. And that's where you move from trying to just arrest individual people who have actually planted a bomb against the police, and you preemptively intern 10 to 20% of an entire ethnic group. That's paranoia, and that comes out of the fear that results from the desire to control, but you can't control the human soul. I hope it's a very complex topic to discuss in a hearing, but I hope I've touched on it.
Well, it's a profound level of fear and insecurity from an autocrat who wants to be the most powerful man in the world. Last hearing, the committee heard a statistic that China spends more than any other country in the region on its military, but it spends even more than that on internal security. I'd imagine that no small amount of that money is going to the enormous technological infrastructure that the Chinese Communist Party is using to perpetrate this genocide and the accompanying societal repression. China has over half the world's security cameras, surveillance cameras. It uses highly advanced facial recognition to know where its citizens are and monitor what they are doing. And then it uses AI to identify citizens for further persecution. Mr. Turkel, could you describe for us what it is like to walk around the city of Xinjiang, surrounded by this technology of repression? How frequently do Uyghur residents encounter security cameras, checkpoints? What happens at those checkpoints?
It is a total controlled police state. Leninist police state. Now it has gotten to the point of the Uyghur homes having QR codes on the door. The government could track, who lives there, what kind of family history, travel history, family connection. They also forcibly install spying apps on the mobile phones. This is precisely why our fellow Americans here in the United States even cannot comfortably contact their family members out of concern that one phone call, one text message, one video chat may end up causing them trouble, if not straight to the concentration camps. On this note, I want to also mention something that the U.S. government didn't get much media attention. Late 2021, U.S. Commerce Department added to the entity list of a military medical academy and its 11 affiliates for developing brain control weaponry. That has not attracted enough attention. Commerce Secretary specifically said that that weapon to be used on ethno-religious groups. So that gives you an idea what kind of totalitarian state that we're talking about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And tonight's testimony about the genocide of the Uyghur people, the mass internment, the rape, the torture, the sexual abuse, the forced sterilization, the forced abortions, the heartbreaking forced separation of parents from children, the psychological abuse and coercion, all of these human rights atrocities point to the urgent need for moral and intellectual clarity. What we do not need is nuance or ambiguity. We must face the truth that there is a very real struggle between religious tolerance and an evil, toxic intolerance by the CCP, a paranoid depravity that says that if you are a religious minority or a person of faith who fails to conform with the CCP's rigid party-state ideology, then you must be destroyed. This CCP ideology of evil, extreme religious intolerance, and immoral disregard for basic human rights must be confronted, and we must impose costs, as Dr. Zenz testifies. Because the longer it's not confronted, the more the CCP will be emboldened and the more lives will be shattered. So tonight, let's affirm the objective superiority of U.S. Western values of individual freedom and dignity, religious liberty, freedom of conscience, and political democracy over the repressive features of Chinese communism and the CCP's brutal surveillance state totalitarianism. As many of us are aware, the People's Republic of China was elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council. According to the United Nations, the Human Rights Council is, quote, responsible for strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights around the globe and for addressing situations of human rights violations. To any of our witnesses, what message does it send to the Uyghur people and to other oppressed groups around the globe that China continues to hold a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council?
It sends a very disturbing message, to say the least. We have seen time and time again, most recently, there was a motion to debate on the Human Rights High Commissioner's report on the Xinjiang government's genocide of the Uyghurs. We could not even secure 19 votes, so the other side won. So it's a place for the Chinese government to abuse its seat. That's just one piece of it.
Now, President Biden argued that rejoining the UN Human Rights Council would give the United States a seat at the table to stop ongoing human rights abuses. Can any of our witnesses identify specifically what relief the United States has been able to achieve through the UN Human Rights Council since rejoining in October of 2021?
Arguably, the presence of the United States on the UN Human Rights Council has been a positive contribution, especially for the women of Iran right now, who are fighting every day for their freedoms. I think also in the instance of the case of the Uyghurs, the U.S. did attempt to put a focus on this. And I think what it surfaced was just how incredibly sophisticated the Chinese government's efforts are to counter the efforts of the U.S. and like-minded governments, and why it's so important for us to redouble our work in trying to make sure that we are using every possible avenue that exists to raise the plight of the Uyghurs. It exposed just how far the Chinese government will do. And why is that important? It shows that they do care about their reputation. They do find ways to get other actors to voice support. I know that that might not seem like a significant change in behavior, but I think it is notable that they are monitoring. They're monitoring evenings like today. They're monitoring discussions that are happening in Geneva, at the General Assembly, within the Security Council. I would argue that the plight of the Uyghurs is a situation that should not just be relegated to conversations within the Human Rights Councils. It's a conversation that should be taken before the General Assembly and before the Security Council. And I know that as one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, that makes it incredibly difficult. But the Chinese government and the actions, the commission of these crimes against the Uyghur people is a threat to international peace and security, and as such, should be something that is brought before the Security Council.
Thank you. And Dr. Zenz, can you elaborate on your written testimony about the fact that not a single member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo has been designated for their role in the ongoing genocide in Xinjiang? And let's highlight the speech from Chen Quango, who led the efforts in the concentration camps in Xinjiang, who referenced the General Secretary who's, quote, sent me to Xinjiang, first not in order to merely be an official, not in order to make a fortune, not in order to have nothing but an empty title. The General Secretary sent me to Xinjiang in order to make a stable Xinjiang arise.
Yes. We have, from these classified documents, now unprecedented evidence of central government involvement in the atrocity of Xi Jinping himself commandeering Chen Quango as party secretary, moving him from Tibet to Xinjiang, In the speech of China's National Minister of Public Security from 2018, he said that Xi Jinping was aware that the prison capacity in Xinjiang was a problem, that they needed more prison capacity, and that the central government in Beijing was promising money to hire more prison guards. This is a speech from June 2018. And I think it's a severe deficiency that the United States government has not gone and sanctioned some of these central government officials, not just in Xinjiang, because I think that that's a political problem, because it communicates to the Chinese government what they are saying, namely that it's a local issue, not a national issue. But the problem is the atrocity is a national issue, but you only make it a national issue if you go after perpetrators in Beijing. I think that would send a major signal to the Chinese government.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Kana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for your very powerful testimony, and I echo my colleagues that I admire very much your courage in being here. I appreciate, Dr. Zenz, your work, early work in describing this as a genocide, which now the State Department, our State Department, has recognized. I understand that your early work estimated that there were about 1 million people who have been detained. I wonder, what is the number today?
The latest evidence from the Xinjiang police files, both from the speech of China's National Minister of Public Security, Zhao Keji, who estimates that over 2 million people in southern Xinjiang are infected by religious extremism, requiring treatment, and spreadsheets, extensive spreadsheets based on nearly 300,000 individuals in one county, indicating an internment of between 12 and 12.5% of the entire county's ethnic adult population. Based on these data points, my current estimate of mass internment in the region is broadly between 1 and 2 million, and it's on purpose a range because we don't have anything precise, but we can now with greater, I think, accuracy and authority say that very likely between 1 and 2 million were detained at some point. We just don't know who's been released, who's been shifted, where. We've seen this huge prison complex. And unfortunately, actually, just in January this year, after the protests in Urumqi, after the fire, I've been hearing reports of a new wave of detention, at least in Urumqi and possibly in other cities. There's nothing more detailed.
So currently about 1 to 2 million are detained?
I would say 1 to 2 million in total have been detained. The current detention numbers are very difficult to ascertain.
Mr. Turkel, would you know what the current detention is?
You know, I rely on what the Chinese government says in its white paper, stating that since 2015, 1.3 million Uyghurs went through a re-education program. If you add them up, you come up with a staggering number. They said this in a white paper. It has been widely cited.
I guess when I'm trying to drive it, I agree, I admire your work on genocide, and I'm trying to understand what is going to be effective U.S. policy to try to get those numbers down and to try to help in human rights. And so, is the situation improving? Is it getting worse? Do we have any sense?
I think there's a lot of indication that the mass internments peaked sometime in 2018, probably the second half of 2018. People were beginning to be released from the camps into forced labor in late 2018, 2019. More people were being released by the end of 2019, but also quite a few were shifted to high security internment facilities, such as prisons, high security prisons, an unknown percentage. My estimate is several 100,000 at least were shifted into forced labor, probably several 100,000 at least shifted to prisons.
Let me ask the question this way maybe. What would either of you say has been the most effective U.S. policy that has had an impact in helping Uyghurs in China?
The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
And to you, Mr. Turkel, and also in your testimony, I was very surprised. I'm sure you're right that all these things are still coming from the Uyghur region, because I would have assumed that the Forced Labor Act would have prevented that. Is that just not being enforced, or how are all these products
Here's the
coming
good
in?
news. This is not a lost cause. We are, even though this genocide is still underway, we don't know how many people being detained and died. We're seeing some progress. Just today in the news that more than 50% of 900 American companies being surveyed in Beijing, in China, said they're not in favor of investing in China. So that's a good news. And also, a couple of years ago, Washington Post reported that one major yarn supplier were kind of complaining in their stock exchange report that they lost significant amount of money. On the economic side, yes. But on the political side, in a bilateral, multilateral aspect, no. So if you can, there's a back and forth. Some days we hear strong positions, strong statements. Some days we hear lukewarm responses and statements. And if we have been doing this alone, this has to be a global endeavor. That way we might be able to be able to help in a certain way.
Representative Khanna, may I answer as well?
My time's
Briefly, if you would.
I just wanted to make note that perpetrators shift their tactics in response to evolving conditions. And I think we need to be very careful when asking and trying to ascertaining that question of where have we seen behavioral change. We need to actually task the intel community to look specifically for that type of information to help guide the efforts that are being undertaken. There has to be greater enforcement. There are serious concerns that forced labor is increasingly being an area that is now being pushed underground, whereby, yes, we might see a movement away from the types of products that could be coming to the United States, but could be going to other countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So we need to be monitoring how the Belt and Road Initiative and those outputs are potentially being impacted by forced labor coming from Xinjiang and other ways in which that is having an impact.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I too would like to thank the first two witnesses, the two ladies, for sharing your testimony and your experience at the hands of the CCP. I want to thank you for bringing to the top of our conscience and our awareness here in the United States the plight of the Uyghur people and the genocide they're experiencing in China. I have a question either for Mr. Turkel or Dr. Zenz, I believe. Xinjiang, I'm sorry I pronounced the location, Xinjiang, has polysilicon production for solar panels, which, let me tell you, has truly wreaked havoc in our domestic manufacturing, in my district particularly, all while using forced labor and selling panels around the world. We also believe that there are, in this area of China, there are non-ferrous minerals, cobalt, gold, silver, platinum, palladium. Do we know if there are other critical minerals? And on both of these issues, how can we further address sanctions on these minerals and the products that are coming from Xinjiang, from China?
So with polysilicon, it's a bit like cotton. Xinjiang produces 90% of the cotton in China, and so with polysilicon, it's a very high percentage. So it's a very high risk that anything polysilicon solar-related from China is implicated in Xinjiang. And so one strategy, or the strategy to go for, is to divest from China in that respect, to build Western capacity, both for the procurement of the raw materials and the construction of the solar panels. So basically, this is a matter of shifting supply chains. In terms of the general risk, a lot of people are not aware. So this is not just a matter of cotton, polysilicon, tomatoes, and other products. These supply chains have been very specifically implicated, but Xinjiang has two complementary systems of forced labor, one directly out of the camps, the other one out of highly coercive poverty elevation, scooping up villages and rounding them up, basically. And as a result, we have a forced labor problem that extends into a very wide range of industries. Xinjiang is being used because of cheap energy to produce products that are very high energy intensive, such as the production of polysilicon. So that constitutes a particular risk.
Thank you, Dr. Zenz. Chair Turkel, your testimony highlights the danger posed by university research collaboration with Chinese entities that may facilitate advances in surveillance technology. What obligations would you say do foreign universities owe the Uyghur people to ensure that joint research does not contribute to the ongoing genocide? At the very least, should the U.S. government ensure that federal research dollars do not go to entities in China that may contribute to the genocide, the PLA advances, or other human rights in China?
Certainly. There are a number of issues involving our universities. One is research, as you alluded. The other one is self-centering. We're not hearing the vocal China scholars today publicly condemning, for the most part, except for several Xinjiang scholars or Uyghur scholars, still self-centering. They're sometimes just disturbingly echo CCP propaganda. And also, one other point to your research-related questions. A few years ago, there was a professor at Yale Medical School, Kenneth Kidd, was implicated, being widely reported for him bringing in a lab assistant from China's Ministry of Public Security to conduct research on Uyghur DNA. So that gives you an idea what kind of problems that we have. We're talking about university endowments, but we have research projects that have been aiding and abetting some of the stated goals of the CCP government. That includes scientific research, that includes technological engineering field, that also includes biomedical research. That needs to stop.
Well, thank you very much. And again, thanks to all of you for your testimony this evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for coming and sharing this very powerful testimony. And we would be doing a great disservice to your courage and bravery if we don't come out of this with some concrete steps and actions that we can take to move forward. Mr. Turkel, I wanted to start with you. You laid out some very specific proposals in your testimony, laying out some steps that the Secretary of State and other senior officials can do more going forward, or increasing diplomatic efforts to nations hosting Uyghurs or other Muslim-majority nations. You even mentioned this idea of a State Department China regional office program expansion. Can you talk a little bit more about the important role that State Department and diplomacy can make here?
Yes. First of all, Congressman Kim, thank you for asking that question. First of all, we have to elevate human rights in our dialogue with Beijing. They elevated human rights, religious freedom issues as part of their pushback against Western influence starting 2014. That had been integrated into Chinese national security strategy. Where are we? We're still making human rights, religious freedom, individual freedom, press freedom a kind of a secondary issue. That needs to change. Two, we need to revisit our strategies, specifically communication strategies. We have to continue to call it genocide. It's a U.S. policy. Two successive administrations and this Congress recognizes a genocide along with our partners and allies in Western democracy, including Taiwan. So we have to call it genocide, crimes against humanity. That message needs to be repeated every day. And then three, we have to engage like-minded governments, even the governments that are lukewarm. I do a fair amount of international travel. As part of the China regional China officers program, we have only 19 around the world. Each officer has about $50,000 budget that need to be increased.
Yeah, and that's something that I thought, Ms. Kikoler, you mentioned something earlier in this hearing where you talked about, for instance, maybe taking further steps to engage with the UN General Assembly and other nations in that kind of capacity. What I'm taking away from this, would you agree with the idea that it's vital for the United States to engage with the UN and other international organizations in the same way that Mr. Turkel was talking about with other nations as well?
It is absolutely essential for the U.S. to be engaging in constant dialogue with those organizations, but also in those international fora. Under the Trump administration, one of the really important things that they did was they actually convened a high-level meeting at the United Nations, including senior UN officials, to raise the profile of the plight of the Uyghurs, of which many of the people in this room participated. It was one of the first instances in which the discussion of the Uyghurs and the commission of the crimes against them was actually brought to the international fora. It's really important that we continue to see that ongoing level of putting a face to the crimes,
Yeah.
and that we do that before the UN bodies. Thank you.
And I really think that this hearing is so important. If first of all highlights the atrocities that are happening, but it also is showing us why we need to have a comprehensive approach, why we need to use all the tools at our disposal here. You know, this is something that where we recognize that this crisis demands more diplomatic action, more coalition building with nations and institutions around the world, and more efforts in that capacity here. We have an office, we have offices and people at the State Department and elsewhere charged with this, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, others working with refugees and humanitarian assistance, but I believe they can do more. Ms. Kikoler, would you agree that it would be productive if we can take what we heard today and work in a bipartisan way to increase our support for these diplomatic efforts at State Department and USAID?
Yes, without a doubt. I mean, I think we're in a situation where, as we've all stated before, there can be no single country that is going to solve the problem right now that is facing the Uyghur community. We have to have a multilateral and an international response to the crimes that are occurring. The role of Congress is absolutely critical. In 2018, there was the passage of the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act, of which many of you co-sponsored and signed on to it. It explicitly said that the prevention of these types of crimes is a core national security interest of the U.S. government.
Yeah.
You have the ability to ask the current administration what they are doing to integrate the protection of the Uyghur people in broader China policy, and what that means both in terms of domestic but also international engagement. Thank you.
What I hope we think through here is, because I'm a little worried here, because I was just in a Foreign Affairs Committee hearing earlier today with Secretary Blinken, and there were serious concerns raised there that the Republican majority is considering steps like returning to FY22 budgetless spending levels or other spending proposals that could levy billions of dollars of budget cuts on the State Department and USAID. Now, in our last hearing, we heard a lot about the need to be able to surge resources when it comes to our military might and deterrence. And today, I hope we take these unbelievably powerful testimonies and heed the call to invest in our diplomacy, our global coalition building, and to encourage and surge our work with international institutions. And I hope all of us on both sides of the aisle commit to increasing, not decreasing, our investment in diplomacy with the same urgency as we talk about for our military. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here this evening and your valuable testimony, and especially the powerful and sobering testimony from the brave women who spoke on our first panel. Much of what has been shared this evening is a powerful reminder of how fortunate we are to be living in the United States, to have the freedoms guaranteed to us. The treatment of the Uyghur people by the Communist Chinese Party resembles that of a dark dystopian novel. And hearings like this are essential in alerting Congress and the American people that these acts are not some far-fetched fictional event. They are real, and they are happening as we speak. The United States must continue to play an active role in condemning this egregious treatment through a combination of directed humanitarian, economic, and diplomatic efforts. As we look at the global economy and international trade, we need to be vigilant in all levels of our supply chains. Turning a blind eye to forced labor practices cannot be tolerated, regardless of the circumstances. Mr. Turkel, as we previously mentioned, passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act by the Congress was a great step expressly combating against these forced labor practices, particularly in the Xinjiang region. But our work is obviously far from finished. In your view, what should some of the immediate next steps be for the Congress to take? Is it looking at the sectors currently labeled as high priority by the Department of Homeland Security and considering new sectors that should be added? Or are there other steps that should be taken first?
Three things. One, thank you for the question. First, we need to have a full briefing. This committee could organize a full briefing on the obstacles to fully implement this significant law. And then two, we need to close the black hole as part of the USMCA agreement that bans forced labor-produced products. But the Xinjiang exports are still making it to the United States, reportedly through Mexico and Canada. So that needs to be addressed. And then also Europe has been a dumping ground. There's no national or European Parliament, European Union level of engagement or policy responses have been announced. A couple of years ago, there was a report published by USCIS. It reported Italy in the year 2019-2020, the export volume to Italy from Xinjiang doubled. So we have Europe being still one of the continued destination for so we have to get Europeans and other allies, even including Japan, including Australia, to essentially do something that this Congress did.
Thank you for that. I think we can all agree that in order for there to be some sort of meaningful change, we're going to need more commitments from our allies around the globe, and also be taking constructive steps to combat these atrocities. I think the hypocrisy is, and the irony is, when you look at the Arab world, who obviously many of the Sunni countries share a religious heritage with the Uyghurs. And I want to, it was mentioned earlier about the Belt and Road Initiative by Ms. Kikoler. I want to read a statement here that's in an article from June 2nd, 2022, titled, "Why Muslim Countries in the Middle East Support Chinese Atrocities in Xinjiang." Here's what it says. Chinese Belt and Road initiatives projected to grow to over $1 trillion by 2027 are especially important for Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, all of which have signed comprehensive strategic partnerships, one of the highest levels of Belt and Road partnership with China. Consequently, each of these states has firmly defended China's oppressive actions in Xinjiang. In addition to publicly endorsing China's Xinjiang policies, all of these countries have deported Uyghurs back to China at Beijing's request. The defensive motivations and behavior are clear. Egypt and Saudi Arabia want to continue the Belt and Road initiatives with China. I'm going to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, 3 articles. One from Time Magazine from March 24th, 2022, titled, "The Arab World Isn't Just Silent on China's Crackdown on Uyghurs, It's Complicit." Number 2, from The Hill, December 9th, 2022, "Arab Nations Should Press China on Uyghur Muslim Abuses." And thirdly, the article I just talked about from the Institute for the Study of Democracy, June 2nd, 2022, "Why Muslim Countries in the Middle East Support Chinese Atrocities."
Without objection, it'll be added to the record.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And once again, an incredibly heartfelt thank you to Ms. Haitiwaji and Ms. Sidik for your truly moving testimony, to hear about the unique vulnerabilities of women being exploited by the genocide taking place in China right now is really heartbreaking. And quite frankly, equally heartbreaking is hearing about how young people are at these camps. I have 2 teenagers, and to hear that 17 and 18-year-olds are being exploited in the same ways at these camps is horrifying. So thank you for your testimony, for the courage it takes when I know you must fear for family members and relatives at home. Thank you as well, Mr. Turkel. Again, horrible to hear you may never see your parents again. And the courage that you've shown as well, it really, I think, humbles all of us here tonight. So thank you. We heard tonight some testimony about the Chinese TikTok company and how they have participated in the surveillance architecture of the state and have been complicit in the genocide taking place against the Uyghurs. And yet, at a hearing earlier today, when TikTok CEO Chu was asked about this, he said, quote, "I'm here to discuss TikTok and what we do as a platform." It seems as if a more complete answer would have included what TikTok does as a platform to help architect the surveillance state, which has been involved in these atrocities. But it's not TikTok alone. We know that Chinese technology companies, many of which still do business here in the United States, are providing surveillance and tracking technology that not only enable the surveillance state in China, but also for would-be autocrats across the world. So Representative Pfluger and I have legislation, the Uyghur Human Rights Sanctions Review Act, that would give President Biden the authority to sanction these companies under the Global Magnitsky Act, and I think my colleagues on this committee could be instrumental in getting that legislation across the finish line, and that's something I will work to do along with them. We have taken steps, important steps, as we've heard, like the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, to boost incentives to reshore our supply chains and reward those companies that do the right thing. But we all know tonight more must be done, and I look forward to working with the members of this committee to finish that work. So, given the secrecy of Beijing's human rights abuses in Xinjiang and the difficulty in finding information on the labor used to produce goods for export, how can the U.S. government, how can we do better at making sure we are further boosting insights into how certain products are made in China and making sure that we have a supply chain that does not involve labor from Xinjiang or exporting that through third-party countries back into the United States? And Mr. Turkel, Mr. Zenz, if you'd like to reply.
First of all, Congresswoman, thank you so much for your sympathy with my family situation. I wish the circumstances will change, and I will welcome my mother back to the United States to meet her American children and American grandchildren. She has 5 U.S.-born grandchildren, but she only met 1 so far. It's painful. It's extremely painful. To your question, a couple of things need to be taken into consideration. One, as I alluded earlier, this bill has faced some challenges. It is almost disturbing to hear the folks who are advocating cooperation with China on climate crisis wanted to water this down. That's a wrong approach. Laws made to be implemented. We need to fully implement this law. And then the other thing that we need to look into is close the loopholes within China. We've been receiving news regarding human trafficking, transporting Uyghur workers to inland China. We're also hearing change of labels, country of origin. Technology should be able to address that. I recently spoke at the Tech Expo organized by CBP. They're talking about using DNA technology to trace. So technology and also consumer advocacy is also very important.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Dr. Dunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to echo the sentiments of all my colleagues in thanking Ms. Haitiwaji and Ms. Sidik for their testimonies. Speaking here, reliving your experience takes immense courage and strength. Americans and people around the world need to hear your story, so thank you very much. As the chairman mentioned, we stand ready to help and build off some of our earlier progress. During the 117th Congress, we passed H.R. 6256 to ensure that goods made with forced labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur region of China do not enter the United States market. Just 3 months ago, we passed H.R. 4785, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which passed the House with broad bipartisan support. This bill will address human rights violations committed against Uyghurs and other minority groups in the Xinjiang region. Still, there's a lot more work to be done, and I thank the chairman for his leadership in fighting this egregious human rights abuse. Forced movements, forced labor, torture, brainwashing, genocide, all at the hands of CCP. The list goes on. Personally, I'm particularly disturbed by the Chinese Communist Party's forced organ harvesting practice. As a physician, I know the miracle of organ transplantation. It's life-saving for many people. For those who choose, and I emphasize choose, to donate organs, they're doing great service to others. However, the need for organs is much greater than the number of donations can meet. According to the United Network for Organ Sharing, more than 100,000 people in the United States need an organ transplant, but last year just 43,000 transplants occurred. So how is it that in China, wait times for hearts and lungs are significantly shorter than in other countries? In fact, articles suggest that patients are even given their dates of surgery well in advance. This seemingly unlimited supply of organs tells us the organs are harvested on demand, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record statement of Mr. Ethan Gutman on forced organ harvesting in China, with no exception.
With no objection.
Thank you. In May of 22, a Tom Lantos commission hearing, human rights investigators uncovered that detainees of about 28 years old in the camps were undergoing health checks that included blood tests and cross matches for organ harvesting. According to this report, some of the detainees are forced to wear color-coded bracelets after the health check, and they vanish, they disappear from the camps in the middle of the night. These facts and details paint a horrific picture, but don't take our word for it. On the screen behind me and on the poster in front of me is a published interim judgment of the China Tribunal. I'd also like to enter this into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. In December of 18, the China Tribunal pronounced its final judgment on organ harvesting in China, concluding that the tribunal's members are certain, unanimously, and sure beyond a reasonable doubt that in China, forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience has been practiced for a substantial period of time involving a very substantial number of victims. That's simply horrifying to a surgeon. Must tell you. Ms. Sidik, you spoke of one of your students who disappeared. And I invite you to enlarge on this story of any other things you know about these people from camps disappearing. And by the way, the rest of the panel, if you have insights, I invite you to lean in as well.
Mən şu cəza lageri turub atqan vaxtlarımda aşağıdakı məni apırıb əkildiğən sağ şoförlərini anlağandım. Ürümçi Michivanga joylashgan nayiti keng ko'lamdagi zahar tashlatqizish o'rni ishki organ savdo o'rniga aylanib ketgan ekan.
As I worked at the concentration camps, I overheard that the policeman who drives the car and transports people, and that the policemen were talking to each other. They said that there was one drug rehabilitation center in Michuan, Urumqi, but later that place turned into organ transplant center.
Well, these are horrible things to contemplate. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It shouldn't be lost on us that we are having this hearing on the close of a 3-day visit that President Xi has taken to Moscow, standing with Mr. Putin, proclaiming their distrust of the United States while Mr. Putin's illegal war in Ukraine takes place, while more crimes against humanity are being inflicted. And it was a convening arranged under the guise of brokering peace in a conflict whose pretense is universally known to be fabricated. The gross deception that comes from a leader whose actions in Xinjiang, our own State Department across multiple administrations has determined to constitute crimes against humanity and genocide. Mr. Turkel, do you have any reflections on why President Xi would be in Moscow working to align himself with Mr. Putin at this time, in this moment, even as we're having this conversation here this evening?
So from just observing the meeting and news reports, he wants to tell the Chinese people that he is still welcomed as a key international player by showing up there. Previously to Central Asia, as we may recall, that he received highest state honor in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, despite the fact that the Kazakhs and the Uyghurs, so as Uzbeks, essentially from the same family. So that he wants to show to the domestic audience that he is still a player in the international community. As you know, the Chinese government has been somewhat isolated in the last few years. And then two, he wants to to find a way to improve China's economic condition. They are not doing well. So those are the two observations. And also, before the Putin's re-invasion of Ukraine, as you may recall, last February, they signed almost unconditional love letter. So that need to be displayed. So that's my take on the visit.
Yeah, and it's certainly exceptional and profound to have Ms. Haitiwaji and Ms. Sidik testifying before us here in Women's History Month on the atrocities that are taking place in these labor camps. And as we saw on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we were able to decouple to an extreme extent from Russia. We were able to break off ties. And something our committee is wrestling with is this economic consideration. And we are well aware, based on tonight's hearing, more so aware of the Forced Labor Prevention Act, creating the presumption that goods produced or manufactured in Xinjiang or by entities with certain ties to Xinjiang that are made with forced labor unless determined otherwise. And we need to figure out, and I'm wondering, Mr. Turkel, if you could help us to identify the potential vulnerabilities in the existing law that allow the CCP to get their exports around this Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act.
One of the things in that has not been helpful is the $800 de minimis that they need to be addressed. Because of that, some of the consumer products are still available. Just to search.
A lot of things cost less than $800.
Yeah, DJI, and on Amazon, you will get at least 3 dozen hits. That is a sanctioned company because the drone is apparently less than $800. So we have to close as simple loopholes as that. And also, I genuinely want the business community to do some soul checking here. We need to tell them, not on my name. We are complicit in this because of, and this is the same business community just repeating, making us feel that we're seeing IBM 2.0.
Yeah. Well, to our survivors, you may not speak our language, but we have heard you tonight, and we will take away on this committee hearing that we will no longer accept the unacceptable. We will no longer allow economics above all else, and we will fight for truth, for justice, and for human rights. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that we haven't talked a whole lot about tonight is the why. Why does the CCP round up and persecute the Uyghurs? Mr. Turkel, is it merely or entirely because of their religion, their Muslim faith?
To the Chinese government, stability is a paramount concern. Starting 2012, 2013, all the way to 2014, they identify liberalism, Islamism, or Western religion, foreign religion, Western influence, posing an existential threat to the CCP leadership. So in order to do that, in order to tackle that problem, they come up with this preemptive policing. So the way that they're describing the religion in particular, like likening it to thought virus, infectious disease, is very telling. So to the CCP government, the Uyghur people's ethno-religious identity is a virus. that will impact, that will become a bigger problem if the Uyghurs remain to be a distinct ethno-religious group. Same thing is happening, similar thing is happening to the Tibetan people, but the most vulnerable community under that, the Western influence pushback effort is the Christians and Muslims. So that shows to the Chinese a sign of disloyalty and potential political threat.
As you know, earlier today, the CEO of TikTok appeared before a congressional committee. After the committee, his COO, one of his top executives, said that the criticism of TikTok coming from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle was rooted in xenophobia. One congressman, Jamal Bowman, even went as far to agree and said it's racist to suggest that we would ban TikTok or to attack TikTok. I wonder, Mr. Turkel, is it a strategy of the Chinese Communist Party to deflect criticism by calling that criticism racist, or to talk about Asian American hate, or to use that type of rhetoric and innuendo to deflect criticism overall?
Certainly, they're also taking advantage of American ignorance. They're just presenting something available on the App Store that you can download and watch short videos, but they're missing the point. It's intoxicating American minds of the American youth through the fake news, through disinformation. Just case in point, genocide denial. The guy that I alluded earlier could not even acknowledge that this government he's affiliated with through his job is committing genocide. So American people need to know this company is one of the biggest facilitators, enablers of the ongoing genocide.
Yeah, and it's not helpful to use that type of rhetoric, right? I mean, it diminishes the whole point of speaking out against genocide and doing something about it. You would agree with that?
Yeah.
Would you say that the Biden administration has downplayed Uyghur genocide?
To Biden administration's credit, starting from 2020, there are a number of significant decisions were made. For example, acknowledging the previous administration's genocide determination was a huge relief for a lot of us. And also something significantly done was the coordinated sanctions in March 2021 with Canada, UK, and European Union. That should be the new norm. I would like to see that. And I also would like to see the Biden administration continue to raise this as it did in 2021 at the G7. But what is not acceptable today is that some officials in the Biden administration trying to tone down human rights criticism on China's ongoing genocide to get a Chinese cooperation in the climate crisis. But we're not seeing this issue on the same page. Climate crisis is not a top priority for the Chinese government. They will do what is best for them, what serves their interests, the leadership and Communist Party, not because of our urging.
Can you speak to any specific incidents of, or examples of the State Department backing off, confronting China?
State Department has not do that yet, but I'm just troubled by some of the comments made by Special Envoy John Kerry. Comments made by Energy Secretary recently complimenting China's investment in green technology. They steal, they subsidize, they use dirty coal, and they enslave human beings. What kind of green technology investment that we're talking about here?
Dr. Zenz, very quickly, I have just a couple of seconds left. Can you talk about how the CCP intimidates Uyghurs inside of the United States?
It does so through automated phone calls, at least in some countries. I don't know if the automated phone calls are also a thing in the US. With the embassy, the threat of not extending passports. And the CCP has an extensive strategy of surveying and intimidating dissidents of all kinds. And that's a big problem.
Thank you. My time is expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Auchincloss.
Thank you, Chairman. As one of 24 Jewish representatives in the House, I know too well the consequences of failures to confront hate and mass atrocities. In 1919, nearly 100,000 Jews were murdered in pogroms in Ukraine and Poland. My great-grandparents, like so many families today, escaped the pogroms in Ukraine to save their lives. In the years following the further mass murder of the Holocaust, Radio Free Europe was conceived by the United States to utilize the talents of post-World War II Soviet and Eastern European émigrés in support of American foreign policy and international democracy and human rights. In our first hearing, I spoke with Mr. Pottinger about the importance of supporting independent journalism. Radio Free Asia, also developed and funded through the United States Agency for Global Media, is providing these services of independent journalism in the Indo-Pacific region. They were the first media outlet to publish reporting about the CCP's internment, forced separation, slave labor, and sterilization of the Uyghur people. Ms. Kikoler, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has a list of, quote, tools for atrocity prevention, which include naming and shaming and fact-finding. Can you explain the role of the free press in preventing and exposing human rights abuses in China?
Thank you so much for the question and also for sharing your own personal experience. The role of Radio Free Asia has been incredibly important, and the role of the independent press is essential to telling the story of the Uyghur people. I want to highlight a few things. One is that many of the journalists themselves are Uyghur, and they're telling the stories of their own communities. I can't even imagine the weight that sits on their shoulders as they do that at great risk to their own personal families and also to broader communities. Two, often they're able to do so in the language of the Uyghur language, which the Chinese government is intent on also trying to erase and eliminate. We have to underscore that the Chinese government has destroyed 1/3 of all mosques. They're in the process of really trying to do everything they can to culturally destroy the Uyghur community. So this press is an important way to not just get the story out, but also preserve a historical record and also continuity of the community. But as you mentioned, not just Uyghur journalists, but also independent journalists have been able to go and document the stories of what has happened, telling the stories of individuals and survivors that have been able to actually get out. The Chinese government wants you to think that there is no evidence. There is ample evidence of the crimes that are occurring. Yes, we need unfettered access to Xinjiang, but enough information exists.
Thank you. Mr. Zenz, Dr. Zenz, excuse me. The Victims of Communism website hosts a searchable database of imprisoned Uyghurs from leaked documents, which were authenticated by 14 world-leading outlets. How can the United States government support the continuation of that valuable resource?
I think the United States can make use of it, point out its existence, maybe enable translation in different languages, and a greater leveraging of tools like this. Civil society organizations like ourselves and nonprofits, like be it the Holocaust Museum, Victims of Communism, we have been at the forefront of uncovering aspects of the atrocity and documenting it. And the government has heavily relied on our work, which we are proud of, but sometimes we wonder why the government isn't doing more of this itself. And for example, in 2019, I spoke to State Department and others, and in 2019, it was made clear to me that the United States government was crucially relying on my open source work for understanding the atrocity. And I found it very difficult to believe that a single individual was doing work that in the potentially most powerful or sophisticated government in the world could not. I understand that the capacity has been increased, but still, I think there's a lot of potential.
On the subject of governments doing more, Mr. Turkel, you had mentioned the Human Rights Council vote 19-17 in the fall to prevent even discussion, much less action, on the report on the abuse of the Uyghur people. I'll note that Brazil, India, and Mexico all abstained under pressure from the CCP. What can U.S. diplomats do to convince these rising powers of the global South that their voice is necessary in standing up to the CCP?
Just quickly, we need to have a special envoy. This is a full-time job. I think there's a strong coordination required within our government, interagency, intergovernmental efforts. This has to be an office-level, special envoy level of task so that people will take us seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson.
First, Ms. Haitiwaji, Ms. Sidik, thank you. You have reinforced for us that the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in systemic acts of pure and unadulterated evil. Thank you. Secondly, Mr. Chairman, I would ask for unanimous consent to show a short video from The Economist, which displays the terrifyingly Orwellian surveillance state that the CCP has assembled to control the Uyghur people.
Without objection, the clerk will play the video.
Already the authorities are using facial recognition to name and shame citizens, even for minor offenses like jaywalking. In Beijing, they're using the technology to prevent people stealing rolls of loo paper from public toilets. And across China, police officers are now trialing sunglasses and body cameras loaded with facial and gesture recognition technology. It's helping them to identify wanted suspects in real time. What worries some people here is that as the technology develops, so too does the capacity for it to be abused. Some of those most at risk in this hyper-surveillance future are the ethnic minorities in China. The authorities are using facial recognition cameras to scan people's faces before they enter markets. The system alerts authorities if targeted individuals stray 300 meters beyond their home. In the future, the government plans to aggregate even more data and build a predictive policing program that imposes even tighter controls here. Without checks and balances, China will keep finding new ways to violate the human rights of its citizens. What's already happening in Xinjiang is a warning the rest of the world must heed.
Ms. Kikoler, is that an accurate representation?
I would argue that for the plight of the Uyghur community, the situation's even more dire. You can't walk more than 500 meters without having your face scanned. I think, as our two speakers before mentioned, for all too many Uyghur families, they have a member of the Han community living within their homes. They're being surveilled both through human surveillance and also through high-tech surveillance. So yes, it's an Orwellian system. It's one, as Nury said, where you can simply not escape being followed at any moment, and where right now, as we celebrate Ramadan, merely observing the holiday would be grounds for a person to be detained. Every single Uyghur in this room has family members detained.
So that video is really just the tip of the iceberg.
Yes.
Dr. Zenz, is it accurate to say that American investors and firms are providing Chinese technology firms the resources that they need to develop these high-tech surveillance and control tools?
Yes, they have done so, and in some ways still do. And in some ways it's already too late, because the Chinese are now on the cutting edge for doing so.
So, Mr. Turkel, is it accurate to say that these surveillance tools, as the Chinese Communist Party perfects them by using them to repress the Uyghur people, could be used to surveil Americans?
Absolutely. That's one of the effective tools that they will use to make us to compromise our personal information privacy and also threaten our sovereignty. They will also affect the democratic norms. We're already seeing the signs in Zimbabwe and in countries that they're using Huawei-provided technology to monitor opposition leaders. That would be the new norm that China is trying to create.
Chair Turkel, earlier you talked about Uyghur people being forced to put apps that spy on their devices. I would let everyone know, some of you probably already know, that TikTok has changed its U.S. privacy policy, allowing the app to automatically collect new types of biometric data, including what it describes as face prints and voice prints. Chair Turkel, is it possible that these kind of high-tech surveillance tools are already on American phones?
Yes, that's a spying tool for the Chinese state. They can collect data all around, personal videos, pictures, communications. People argue that our social media companies do that as well, but that's for commercial purpose. But what the Chinese doing it for national security or whatever the data that they have is a valuable data for advancing their AI technology.
I think Ms. Kikoler did the right thing by reminding us that surveillance on a phone is nothing like the kind of heart-wrenching atrocities that are committed to millions of Uyghur people every day. But I would remind Americans that this is not just a problem over there, it is a problem here. Americans need to get TikTok off their phones. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Torres.
China spends more on domestic security than it spends on its own military. At the beginning of Xi Jinping's rule from 2012 to 2017, China's domestic security budget doubled. But in the Xinjiang province, the security budget tripled. Xinjiang has emerged as the most Orwellian police state on earth, with cameras and checkpoints tracking every person and monitoring every behavior that triggers even the slightest semblance of suspicion. The mass surveillance of Uyghurs reflects the pathological paranoia of a regime that lives in existential fear of its own people, that fears the loss of its own power, and that seeks survival and self-preservation by any means necessary, including genocide. At the heart of genocide is the intent to destroy a people. There is clear and convincing evidence that the CCP has the intent to destroy the culture of Uyghurs, to destroy the identity, the history, and the very fertility of Uyghurs as a people. As a result of forced sterilizations, abortions, and IUD insertions from 2017 to 2019, the birth rates in Xinjiang collapsed by 50%, the steepest decline in birth rates in recent history. Not even the genocide in Rwanda or Cambodia or Bosnia produced a comparable collapse in fertility. There are those who do dispute or are hesitant to use the word genocide. But Ms. Kikoler, is it fair to say that the unprecedented collapse in birth rates among Uyghurs, combined with the cultural erasure of Uyghurs through systematic re-education, constitutes compelling evidence of genocide?
I think the situation that you just presented is one that is so incredibly alarming that every single person has to take notice, and we need to uphold our obligation to prevent genocide. The sad reality is that we're looking at a situation where crimes are already occurring, and we should have been responding much earlier to the warning signs and the risk factors of that. And I think it's really important to underscore, and there's been much discussion about the why. Perpetrators have many motivations for why they commit crimes and why they escalate their crimes, including up to genocide. And we need to understand their motivations so that we can develop policies that actually are more strategic and targeted to try to change that behavior. The desire for stability is motivated, yes, by a concern about identity, perceptions of religious extremism, terrorism, splitism, the three evils that the Chinese government advances. But the reality is there's also an economic motivation. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is critical to Xinjiang, has got 3 major intersections that cross through that territory. So the commission of these crimes has many different causes, which we have to put more of an emphasis on.
Well, there is no Belt and Road out Xinjiang.
Exactly.
Right. And it also has an abundance of minerals, the highest energy reserves. It has immense strategic importance to the CCP. You know, as we reflect on the genocide against Uyghurs, I'm reminded of the following quote from Justice Robert Jackson in his opening statement at the Nuremberg trials. "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. And yet, despite this warning, I worry that the international community has lost its sense of shock and horror at the very mention of genocide. And if you are going to invoke the term genocide, as the United States has done, the word genocide, which commands moral weight, must carry with it an obligation to galvanize the world into action. And if you're wondering whether the United States has done enough diplomatically to stop the Uyghur genocide, look no further than the United Nations Human Rights Council, which voted against even debating, let alone denouncing, the human rights violations in Xinjiang. Even Ukraine voted to abstain. Every Muslim country except Somalia voted no. And so, Mr. Turkel, do you believe, as I do, that the United States, as the leader of the free world, must commit ourselves to building a multilateral coalition aimed at stopping the Uyghur genocide?
Absolutely. You know, to your earlier point, words matter. There's a reason to call this genocide. Once we call it, the next step under the Article 1 of the Genocide Conventions is to stop it. And then hold those perpetrators to account. More than 150 countries around the world are state party to the Genocide Convention. Only 10, including some parliaments, our government, give a proper name to this crime. It's a genocide. It's crime against humanity. It is past time for action. Again, as I said, this has been ongoing genocide in the last 6-7 years.
And my time's about to expire, but as we reflect on Ramadan, there is no government on earth that has done more to demonize the Muslim faithful and to desecrate the Muslim faith than the Chinese Communist Party. Absolutely. And with that, I'll leave it at that.
Ms. Hinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and such powerful stories we've heard here tonight, and I have no doubt that this will be the first of many conversations that we have, not just as a committee, but as a Congress, about how tainted our supply chain has become because of the CCP's truly abhorrent use of Uyghur slave labor and acts of genocide against the Uyghur people. It's frankly disgusting and heartbreaking. And we have to do more. So I'll be focusing tonight on sharing the truth about these horrifying links to the CCP's atrocities around the world. We know the Uyghur people have been silenced time and time again in China, but they will not be silenced here tonight. So thank you for sharing your stories. And before we get to our witnesses tonight, my questions, I'd like to share some truly disturbing and eye-opening videos from Radio Free Asia journalists. They are sharing their stories of how the CCP directly targeted them by framing them as terrorists, keeping detailed and often falsified information about them and their families, and in many horrifying cases, detaining their families as well. So I'd like to, Mr. Chairman, if we can play that video.
The clerk will play the video.
My name is Gulchehra Khoja. I'm a journalist at Radio Free Asia. As a journalist for simply doing my job, the Chinese government has sent at least 24 members of my family to the concentration camps and accused me of being a terrorist and put me on their wanted list. Just because we have worked to expose the abuse that by CCP, me and my colleagues at Radio Free Asia, becoming a target of an authoritarian regime.
My name is Mehmet Janjuma. Because of our work at RFA, our families in China have been persecuted and imprisoned. Recently leaked Chinese police documents show that at least 29 of my immediate and extended family have been profiled or detained. I learned that all 3 of my brothers were taken to the camps at some point, and one of them has been sentenced to 14 years in jail for merely receiving my phone calls. My relatives are demonized, targeted, and persecuted purely because of their connection to me. The guilt that I feel haunts me every day. But I know, maybe because of this heavy price, that my work as journalist.
His work does matter. And what a haunting thing to say, that that guilt haunts him every single day because of what's happening to his family. As a former reporter, seeing and hearing about the CCP's silencing of independent journalists and their families is like truly watching a dystopian horror story play out, but it's not a story, it's real. So Ms. Kikoler, can you please provide some historical context for us tonight, comparing how Xi Jinping is containing Uyghurs using facial recognition software, surveillance technology as well, to how the Nazis used containment during the Holocaust?
Thank you so much for your question, and also just for sharing the stories of many of our colleagues. You know, I think that it's really important as an institution. What we try to do is we try to draw the lessons from the past and apply them to the future so that we can hopefully prevent these crimes from occurring. Tragically, what we're doing right now is we're talking about crimes as they are actually ongoing. I think when we think in the Holocaust context, yes, technology was used. It was used as a means of counting Jewish populations, creating censuses to identify the populations, for containing people. But it's very hard to draw comparisons because each situation is so different and so unique. And I think we really need to focus on what is happening right now in China and what are the specifics of the crimes that are being perpetrated by the Chinese government at this particular point. Mm-hmm. What we do know is the commonality in the experiences of the suffering. We know what it feels like, and so many of the Holocaust survivors that have spoken to our Uyghur partners and have participated in events talk about the pain of what it feels to be separated from their loved ones. Though we span 80 years, that is the tie that binds, because that is something that people understand just so intimately on such a human level.
And absolutely, we heard tonight our witnesses describe them being called by numbers, right? And you talk about the similarities there between those situations. With the few moments we have left, Dr. Zenz, can you react to the videos that I shared here tonight and just provide your perspective as someone who's an expert on victimization under communism, which is exactly what we saw?
So one of the strategies, and probably a reason for the scale of the mass internments, is the guilt by association. And we've had the testimony of, detaining family members, punishing individuals by detaining others, and we have horrific incidents where the parents of Uyghur dissidents or Uyghurs in exile were paraded on Chinese state television denouncing their children for advocacy on behalf of the Uyghurs. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have this incredible scale also for the detention by guilt by association.
Thank you, Dr. Zenz. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to start from a place of gratitude by thanking the witnesses, particularly Director Kikoler and the Uyghur survivors, as well as Elisha Wiesel, the survivor of the Holocaust, who gave us a video testimony at the top of this hearing. In Ohio's 11th Congressional District, we are proud to have members of the community that has also dealt with the trauma and legacy of genocide. And yes, I am also referring to the Holocaust. Jewish survivors in Cleveland erected a memorial to the Holocaust, our very own Kol Israel Memorial in 1961, which is the oldest of its kind in the country. Survivors anticipated that scapegoating and hateful sentiments toward marginalized groups could repeat itself and hoped that the memorial would be a beacon of remembrance, education, and a reminder of never again. Tragically, the world has found itself facing actions of danger and intolerance once more. In this committee, we have the opportunity to develop policies that increase our competitiveness through investments in technologies of the future, workforce development and skills-based education, and improving our high-skilled immigration system. As we pursue this committee's work, we must work against xenophobia, anti-Asian stereotyping, and any efforts to raise suspicions against Chinese Americans who do not bear the responsibility of the actions of the Chinese Communist Party. As our witnesses have demonstrated, the Uyghur Genocide and the ramifications of past genocidal movements are relevant today. The lessons we must learn from questions about the Americans' action to address the Holocaust are extremely relevant to our present discussion. According to the Anti-Defamation League, over 3/4 of Americans, 85%, believe at least one anti-Jewish trope, as opposed to 61% found in 2019. 20% of Americans believe 6 or more tropes. It's the highest measured levels in decades. So, Ms. Kikoler, I know you expressed that we have to move forward, but I think it's important that we touch on something from the past so that we can avoid the same mistakes. Can you describe the movements or bigotry that led to the genocide of approximately 6 million European Jews and at least 5 million Soviet prisoners of war, disabled individuals, Romani, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay individuals, and others during the Holocaust?
Thank you so much, Representative Brown, for your question. I think what I'd like to do, perhaps in answering, is just bridge what lies often at the root of the commission of so many of these crimes, and that is unchecked hate. And I think when we talk about Islamophobia, when we talk about anti-Semitism, when we talk about anti-Chinese sentiment, at the root of that is the perception of difference and the inability to come together as a people to understand that we are bound by the same common threads that unite us all. There's no difference between Nury and I. We suffer the same way. Our families and experiences are the same. But I think, unfortunately, what happens all too long is that there is the intentional desire to create divisions amongst people. And when we look at the situation in China, the Chinese government has also been working very hard to create the conditions in which genocidal ideology can take root. The same thing happened in Nazi Germany. What's illustrative in the context of Germany was there was an effort by the Nazi government to do a boycott of Jewish-owned businesses early into their reign. It did not work because neighbors would not turn on neighbors. But yet years later, when they did it again, it was effective. In the context of what is happening in China right now, the longer and longer that these crimes occur, the longer that Chinese government officials are able to utter simply hateful rhetoric to demonize the entire Uyghur community as being terrorists, we're unfortunately entrenching this type of Han supremacy and a genocidal ideology that will be all the harder to undermine and to dismantle. So I think when we think about the lessons of the Holocaust and we think about just the generational trauma that has occurred, we have to be committed here as a group of people who are vested in advancing the best interests of peoplekind, but also of American values, and doing everything we can to stop the crimes happening right now. I think the most important thing that we talk about as an institution is that everything we do matters. Each of us has the ability to affect positive change. And for the American public that are watching right now, as Nury said, this is a genocide that in some ways is proximate. Each of us likely owns a t-shirt that might have come from slave labor in Xinjiang. We may not know it, but we have a responsibility to understand that our actions may be harming people who are living under conditions that are simply incomprehensible, yet they're real.
Well, I want to thank you for that, and again, reiterate my appreciation for everyone's presence here today, and I look forward to continuing productive conversations around strategic competition and maintenance of ethno-religious freedoms here and abroad. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Menace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, I want to thank Ms. Haitiwaji and Sidik for their very powerful testimony. And, you know, I guess I'm going to wrap this up. I'm the last one up, but I want to make sure that people understand that when I speak about the Chinese Communist Party or the government of China, I don't have anything against the Chinese people as a whole. I just hate communism. Yeah. I hate communism because, you know, I come from Cuba. And I had to leave because of a communist state, which a lot of the things that I'm hearing are happening in China, happen in Cuba. Not the same, because I haven't heard of genocide happening in Cuba because they're all Cubans, right? So, can you name me the companies, American companies, that are benefiting from the forced labor and the atrocities committed on the Uyghur people in China? Can you name them? Because somebody said we need to name names here. And so, what American companies are actually profiting from the suffering of the Uyghur people?
The companies that have been in the news includes Nike, Coca-Cola, Intel, and some of the solar panel manufacturers, and also some European companies like Siemens, Volkswagen, as I noted earlier. So there we're talking about more than 80 global brands. It's a large number. This is precisely, this is part of the reason that with the UFLPA, we have not been able to stop the forced labor practices in China.
How are they able to skirt any laws that prohibit the use of forced labor, et cetera, and still operate and sell their products in the United States?
A couple of years, I think it was last year, well, late 2021, CECC held a hearing. They had business representatives, American multinational corporation representatives, and none of them even willing to acknowledge that there's human rights abuses against the Uyghur people. This was on the record that anyone can go and watch on the CECC YouTube channel.
But is it proven is it proven, well, I guess they won't acknowledge it, great, okay. But we know it's happening, right? Right. The other thing that really bothers me about today's hearing was the issue of the organ harvesting. Are any of you aware of this, or any of you deny it? Does anybody think it's not true, or of all the witnesses here, does anybody have any knowledge of that actually happening?
My colleague at Victims of Communism, Matthew Robertson, has published a paper in America's leading transplant journal, examining over 100,000 Chinese academic research papers and closely looking at 2,800 of them. And in 71 Chinese research papers, he found in the text evidence that basically the donor rule was not observed, meaning that several of the persons in question were executed through organ extraction.
So, what I read in the testimony, or at least what I read, was that there's a calculation of some 25 to 50,000 28-year-olds, because apparently that's the age, the great age. The best age to get your organs harvested is when you're 28 years old. The murder of 25, the outright murder of 25 to 50,000 28-year-olds by the Chinese Communist Party for organ harvesting. Does anybody doubt that number? I certainly do. I'll tell you why, because there's also evidence that you can schedule your organ transplant, basically an organ on demand. Now, I find the Chinese Communist Party not only to be repressive and brutal, it's also barbaric. And if we don't do something about it, and if we don't stop this, then my fear is that my children and my grandchildren will one day face a world where they're going to be dominated by this party. And so you may be the bellwether of what could happen to this country, to this world, if we don't take action today. Because the only thing that the Chinese Communist Party reacts to is action, not rhetoric, action. My time is up. I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our witnesses for their incredible testimony and the phenomenal Q&A that we just had. I want to thank our committee members for their thoughtful contributions. Tonight we've been witness to soul-chilling evidence of crimes against humanity. We've heard from experts who showed that the policy of forced sterilization, forced IUD insertion, and forced abortion easily clears any commonly used definition of genocide. We've heard that detainment of Uyghurs is the largest internment of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust. We've heard that the entire region has been turned into an open-air prison through the most oppressive techno-totalitarian surveillance system ever devised. We've heard that American companies are complicit in the forced labor being extracted from the Uyghur population. We have heard that American investors, banks, and pension funds are financing companies engaged in surveillance, forced labor, and the building of internment camps. Most importantly, we heard from Gulbahar Haitiwaji and Qelbinur Sidik, women who were first-hand witnesses in the camps. What else do we possibly need to hear? In Elie Wiesel's Nobel Peace Prize speech, he imagined the boy he'd been in the concentration camps talking to the man he had become. And he said, "And now the boy is turning to me. Tell me," he asks, "what have you done with my future? What have you done with your life?" And I tell him that I've tried to keep memory alive, that I've tried to fight those who would forget. Because if we forget, we are guilty. We are accomplices. And then I explained to him how naive we were, that the world did know and remained silent. My friends, as Ms. Kikoler astutely pointed out in her written testimony, many often wonder what they would have done if they'd been alive during the Holocaust. Today, you said, we want people to ask, now that I know, what will I do? This is our never again moment. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Members, I remind you that your questions for the record are due 1 week from today on March 30th. Your staff will receive instructions shortly. And with that, without objection, the committee hearing is adjourned.